To understand Socrates, we first need to understand the city that produced him. In the 5th century BCE, Athens was unlike any city the world had ever seen. It was wealthy, powerful, and remarkably free compared to its neighbors. Citizens gathered in public assemblies to debate laws. Artists created breathtaking sculptures and dramas. Historians began recording events systematically. Mathematicians and astronomers searched for patterns in nature. It was an age of confidence. People believed human reason could solve almost anything. Traveling teachers known as sophists became famous for teaching rhetoric, the art of persuasion. If you wanted political success, they could teach you how to argue almost any side of an issue. Notice something important here. The sophists weren't necessarily interested in discovering truth. They were interested in winning arguments. If someone could be persuaded that black was white, then the speaker had done his job. Into this world stepped Socrates. And he was deeply suspicious. Not because people lacked intelligence, but because they were far too confident that they already possessed it. Unlike most famous thinkers, Socrates wrote absolutely nothing. Everything we know about him comes mainly from his students, especially Plato. That means we have to be careful. Sometimes it's difficult to separate the historical Socrates from the literary character Plato created. Nevertheless, one image remains remarkably consistent across all ancient accounts. Socrates spent his days walking through Athens asking questions. He would stop generals, politicians, poets, craftsmen, even young men in the marketplace, and ask them deceptively simple questions. What is courage? What is justice? What makes a good person? At first, the conversation felt easy. The other person confidently gave an answer. Then Socrates asked another question. And another, and another. Slowly, contradictions began appearing. Someone who thought he understood justice suddenly realized he couldn't define it. Someone who believed himself wise discovered he couldn't explain his own beliefs. This method became known as the Socratic method. Instead of teaching people what to think, Socrates forced them to discover how little they actually knew. This wasn't done to embarrass people. It was meant to free them from false confidence. Socrates believed that recognizing ignorance was the first genuine step toward wisdom. His most famous statement perfectly captures this attitude: I know that I know nothing. Whether he actually spoke those exact words is debated, but the spirit behind them certainly reflects his philosophy. Knowledge begins with humility. Now here's something fascinating. Socrates wasn't interested in studying stars, planets, or the composition of matter like many earlier Greek thinkers. He believed a far more urgent question existed. How should a human being live? For Socrates, philosophy wasn't an academic subject. It was a way of life. He argued that people do wrong not because they intentionally choose evil, but because they misunderstand what is truly good. Virtue, according to Socrates, is inseparable from knowledge. When people know the good, they naturally pursue it. This idea sounds optimistic today. After all, don't we all know things we shouldn't do, yet still do them? Socrates permanently connected ethics with rational inquiry. He transformed morality from obedience to tradition into something that could be examined through reason. And that was revolutionary. But revolutions often create enemies. Many influential Athenians became increasingly irritated with Socrates. Young people loved listening to him expose the ignorance of respected politicians. Those politicians, unsurprisingly, did not appreciate the experience. Then Athens suffered military defeat in the Peloponnesian War. The city entered a period of political instability. Whenever societies become anxious, they often begin searching for someone to blame. Socrates became a convenient target. He was accused of corrupting the youth. He was also accused of impiety, of failing to respect the city's traditional gods. Whether these accusations were sincere or politically motivated remains debated. What we know is this. In 399 BCE, Socrates stood trial. The jury found him guilty. He was sentenced to death. His friends arranged an escape. Everything was ready. He could have fled Athens. Instead, he refused. Why? Because he believed that if he had spent his entire life urging citizens to respect justice and law, then escaping his own legal sentence, even an unjust one, would contradict everything he had taught. So he stayed. Surrounded by friends, Socrates calmly drank a cup of poison hemlock. According to Plato, his final hours were spent discussing the immortality of the soul. That image has inspired philosophers for over 2,000 years. Socrates died with no books, no political office, and no wealth. Yet his influence would become immeasurable. Almost every major philosophical movement in the West traces part of its ancestry back to him. His greatest contribution wasn't a doctrine. It was a method. He taught humanity that questioning assumptions is often more valuable than accepting comfortable answers. But here, an enormous problem remained. Socrates spent his life asking questions. He rarely offered complete answers. If justice exists, what is it? If virtue can be known, where does that knowledge come from? If truth exists, what exactly is truth? His students admired his method. Fortunately, one of those students possessed both extraordinary literary talent and one of the greatest philosophical imaginations in history. His name was Plato. When Plato first met Socrates, he intended to become a politician. Then he watched his teacher executed by the very democracy that claimed to value wisdom. The experience changed him forever. If Athens could condemn its wisest citizen to death, Plato wondered, what was fundamentally wrong with human society? Plato was born around 427 BCE into one of Athens' most distinguished aristocratic families. His relatives included influential politicians, military leaders, and public officials. From birth, he was expected to enter politics himself. He received the finest education available. He studied poetry, music, mathematics, gymnastics, everything a future statesman needed. In many ways, Plato seemed destined for a successful political career. Then he met Socrates. Like countless young Athenians, Plato was captivated by this unusual old man who wandered the streets asking questions no one could answer. At first glance, Socrates didn't appear impressive. He owned no grand academy, he held no government office, he charged no fees for his conversations. Yet somehow, this barefoot philosopher possessed something far more valuable than influence. He possessed intellectual integrity. For years, Plato followed him, listening carefully as Socrates dismantled the certainty of politicians, poets, craftsmen, and generals alike. Then came the trial, the execution, and with it, Plato's faith in Athenian democracy collapsed. If public opinion could kill the city's wisest citizen, perhaps public opinion wasn't a reliable guide to truth after all. Instead of entering politics, Plato chose something far more ambitious. He would spend the rest of his life trying to discover what true justice actually looked like. Socrates had taught people how to ask questions, but he rarely offered complete answers. Plato wanted answers. Suppose Socrates asked, "What is justice?" Most people would point to examples: a fair judge, an honest ruler, a good law. But Plato noticed something interesting. Every example of justice seems imperfect. Every beautiful object eventually fades. Every courageous person sometimes acts cowardly. Everything we see in the physical world changes. If that's true, then how do we even recognize justice, beauty, or goodness when we encounter them? How can we call two different paintings beautiful unless we already possess some idea of beauty itself? This observation led Plato to one of the most influential theories in the history of philosophy: the theory of forms. Imagine you're looking at several circles drawn on paper. Some are large, some are small, some are nearly perfect, others are slightly uneven. Despite their differences, you immediately recognize all of them as circles. But here's the puzzle: none of those circles is absolutely perfect. Even the finest drawing contains tiny imperfections. So where did your idea of a perfect circle come from? Plato's answer was astonishing. The perfect circle doesn't exist in this physical world. Instead, it exists in an eternal, unchanging realm of perfect forms. Everything we encounter in ordinary life is merely an imperfect copy. The same, Plato argued, is true for justice, beauty, equality, goodness, even human beings. The physical world constantly changes, objects decay, people age, empires rise and fall, but the forms remain eternal, invisible, perfect, unchanging. According to Plato, true knowledge isn't gained simply by observing the physical world. It comes from understanding these eternal realities. This idea would dominate Western philosophy for centuries. Even today, whenever someone speaks of an ideal version of something, they are echoing Plato's way of thinking. If Plato is remembered for one idea above all others, it is probably this extraordinary story. Imagine a group of prisoners. They have spent their entire lives chained inside a dark cave. They cannot turn around. All they can see is the cave wall before them. Behind the prisoners burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, people walk carrying statues and objects. The prisoners cannot see these objects. They only see the shadows cast upon the wall. Since they have never experienced anything else, they believe those shadows are reality. Now imagine one prisoner is suddenly freed. At first, the sunlight outside blinds him. The real world seems confusing, painful, almost unbelievable, but gradually his eyes adjust. For the first time, he sees trees, animals, mountains, the sky. He realizes that everything he previously believed was real had merely been shadows. Filled with excitement, he returns to the cave to free the others. Instead of thanking him, they laugh. They mock him. Some versions even suggest they would kill anyone who tried to drag them into the light. Plato wasn't simply telling a story. He believed this is the human condition. Most people mistake appearances for reality. Philosophy is the painful journey from illusion toward truth. It's no coincidence that this story reminds us of Socrates. He, too, tried to awaken his fellow Athenians, and they repaid him with a death sentence. Watching democracy execute Socrates convinced Plato that political power should never rest merely on popularity. The best rulers, he argued, should be philosophers, not because philosophers are morally superior by nature, but because they spend their lives searching for truth instead of chasing wealth, fame, or public approval. This became the central idea of his most famous book, The Republic. In this imagined ideal society, everyone performs the role best suited to their abilities. Farmers farm, soldiers defend the city, philosophers govern. At first, this sounds attractive. Wouldn't society benefit if its leaders genuinely loved wisdom more than power? But Plato's vision also raises uncomfortable questions. Who decides which people are wise enough to rule? Can any individual truly possess enough knowledge to govern everyone else? These questions would echo through political philosophy for thousands of years. Around 387 BCE, Plato founded a school just outside Athens. It became known simply as the Academy. Unlike the informal conversations of Socrates, this was a permanent institution devoted to learning. Students studied mathematics, astronomy, politics, ethics, logic, philosophy. For nearly 900 years, the Academy remained one of the world's greatest centers of learning. One young student who entered its gates would eventually surpass even his famous teacher. His name was Aristotle. Plato accomplished something extraordinary. His influence became almost impossible to overstate. As brilliant as his philosophy was, one person remained unconvinced. Ironically, that person was his own greatest student. Aristotle admired Plato deeply. He spent nearly 20 years studying in the Academy. Yet the more he reflected on the theory of forms, the more uncomfortable he became. Did we really need an invisible world of perfect realities to explain the visible one? If every horse in our world participates in a perfect form of horse, then where does that perfect horse exist? And if another explanation is needed for the relationship between the form and the physical horse, doesn't that create an endless chain of explanations? Gradually, Aristotle reached a bold conclusion. Perhaps Plato had divided reality into two worlds when only one was necessary. Rather than looking beyond nature, perhaps philosophy should begin by studying nature itself. And with that single shift, Western philosophy entered an entirely new chapter. If Socrates taught the world how to ask questions, and Plato taught it to search for perfect answers beyond the physical world, then Aristotle brought philosophy back down to earth. Aristotle looked around him, at the plants growing beside a river, at animals roaming the countryside, at governments rising and falling, at ordinary people making ordinary decisions. He believed that before we speculate about another world, we should first understand this one, and in doing so, he became one of the most influential thinkers who has ever lived. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in the small northern Greek city of Stagira. Unlike Plato, who came from a political family, Aristotle grew up in a household closely connected to medicine. His father, Nicomachus, served as court physician to the king of Macedon. From childhood, Aristotle grew up surrounded by careful observation of nature. Long before he became a philosopher, he was already learning to look at the world like a scientist. When Aristotle was 17, he traveled to Athens to study at Plato's academy. Imagine being a young student walking through the gates of the greatest intellectual institution in Greece. There stood Plato himself, the student of Socrates, already famous throughout the Greek world. For nearly 20 years, Aristotle remained there. He admired Plato enormously. He absorbed mathematics, ethics, politics, metaphysics, and dialectic. Few students have ever respected their teacher more. Yet respect does not always mean agreement. As Aristotle matured, he began noticing something that troubled him. Plato's philosophy was elegant, beautiful, almost poetic. But was it true? A famous saying, traditionally attributed to Aristotle, goes something like this: Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth. Whether he spoke those exact words is uncertain, but they perfectly describe his attitude. He believed Plato had made a crucial mistake. Remember the theory of forms. According to Plato, every object in the physical world is merely an imperfect copy of a perfect, eternal form existing beyond space and time. A beautiful flower is beautiful because it participates in the perfect form of beauty. A just action reflects the perfect form of justice. It sounds convincing, but Aristotle asked a simple question. If the forms explain this world, who explains the forms? And another, if we never encounter these perfect forms directly, how can we know they exist? Instead of multiplying invisible worlds, Aristotle proposed something much simpler. Reality is already here. Study it. That single decision changed the direction of Western thought. Imagine you're trying to understand what a tree is. Plato might encourage you to think about the eternal form of treeness. Aristotle would probably hand you a notebook. Go observe one, then another, then another. Notice their similarities. Notice their differences. Compare them. Classify them. Look carefully before making conclusions. Aristotle believed knowledge begins with experience. The world itself is the philosopher's laboratory. Instead of imagining how nature ought to work, observe how it actually works. That attitude would eventually become one of the foundations of scientific thinking. Of all Aristotle's contributions, perhaps none has influenced human thought more than logic. People had always argued. But Aristotle wanted to understand why some arguments are valid while others are not. He began identifying patterns, rules, structures. Suppose someone says, all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Even if you've never studied philosophy, your mind immediately recognizes that the conclusion follows logically from the premises. Aristotle was among the first people to analyze these patterns systematically. He didn't invent reasoning itself. Humans had been reasoning for thousands of years. What Aristotle did was something different. He invented the science of reasoning. What makes Aristotle extraordinary isn't simply that he was a philosopher. It's that he seemed interested in absolutely everything: politics, ethics, drama, poetry, biology, astronomy, psychology, economics, memory, friendship, dreams, animals, constitutions, language, motion, weather. If knowledge existed, Aristotle wanted to organize it. Modern universities divide learning into dozens of departments. Aristotle often studied them all himself. He collected marine animals. He described hundreds of species. He compared different political systems. He analyzed tragic plays. He even attempted to explain why people laugh. Of course, not every conclusion he reached was correct. Without modern technology, mistakes were inevitable. Yet his method, observe first, their eyes second, became enormously influential. Like Socrates and Plato before him, Aristotle believed philosophy ultimately concerns human flourishing. But unlike Plato, he didn't believe the ideal life required escaping the physical world. Aristotle believed true happiness, what he called eudaimonia, is something deeper than pleasure. It is living well, flourishing, realizing one's full potential. And how do we achieve that? Through virtue. But virtue, Aristotle argued, isn't something we're simply born with. It becomes a habit. We become virtuous by repeatedly performing virtuous actions. Character is built through habit. One of Aristotle's most famous ideas is surprisingly practical. He observed that many virtues lie between two extremes. Take courage. Too little courage becomes cowardice. Too much becomes recklessness. Generosity lies between stinginess and wastefulness. Confidence lies between insecurity and arrogance. The goal isn't always choosing the exact middle. Context matters. But wisdom often involves avoiding destructive extremes. This idea became known as the golden mean. Around 343 BCE, Aristotle received an unusual invitation. King Philip II of Macedon asked him to educate his 13-year-old son. That boy's name was Alexander. History would later know him as Alexander the Great. For several years, Aristotle taught the future conqueror literature, ethics, politics, science, and Greek culture. How much influence Aristotle had on Alexander's later campaigns remains debated. Alexander eventually built one of the largest empires the ancient world had ever seen. Whether he fully lived according to Aristotle's ethical ideals is another question entirely. Still, it is remarkable to imagine one of history's greatest philosophers educating one of history's greatest military commanders. After returning to Athens, Aristotle established his own school, the Lyceum. Unlike Plato's Academy, where abstract philosophical discussion often took center stage, Aristotle's school resembled something closer to a research institute. Students collected plants, animals, political constitutions, scientific observations. They walked together while discussing philosophy, earning them the nickname peripatetics, meaning those who walk around. Despite his brilliance, Aristotle's philosophy had limitations. His confidence in observation sometimes led him to conclusions that later science would overturn. He believed heavier objects naturally fall faster than lighter ones. He thought the heavens were fundamentally different from the earth. Many of his biological theories turned out to be mistaken. More importantly, his philosophy focused heavily on reason. Could reason alone truly satisfy the deepest needs of the human soul? Could careful observation answer questions about death, meaning, inner peace? As the centuries passed, Greece itself began to change. Alexander's conquests transformed the ancient world. The old city-states declined. Empires replaced them. Political uncertainty spread. People became less interested in asking, what is the ideal state? Instead, they began asking something far more personal. How can I find happiness in an uncertain world? The next generation of philosophers would no longer focus primarily on building perfect societies. They would focus on helping ordinary individuals live peaceful lives. One of the first to offer such an answer was a philosopher whose name has often been misunderstood. Many people today hear the word Epicurean and think of luxurious food, expensive wine, and endless pleasure. Ironically, that is almost the exact opposite of what Epicurus actually taught. Epicurus was born in 341 BC on the island of Samos. His family originally came from Athens. His father was a schoolteacher. His mother reportedly performed religious purification rituals. From an early age, Epicurus became curious about nature. One famous story says that when a teacher claimed everything came from chaos, young Epicurus asked, "And where did chaos come from?" Whether true or not, the story captures his personality. He wasn't satisfied with easy answers. As a young man, Epicurus studied several philosophical traditions. He learned from followers of Plato. He encountered ideas inspired by Aristotle. But the philosopher who influenced him most was Democritus. Democritus proposed something radical. Everything in existence, stars, mountains, animals, people, was ultimately made of tiny invisible particles, atoms, moving through empty space. Epicurus believed this idea explained nature better than myths. Instead of supernatural forces controlling every event, the universe followed natural laws. Around 306 BC, Epicurus returned to Athens. Instead of creating a grand academy, he purchased a modest house with a garden. This became known simply as the garden. Unlike many schools, the garden welcomed people regardless of social status, men, women, even slaves. Everyone could study philosophy together. This is where history misunderstood Epicurus. When people hear pleasure, they imagine excess. Epicurus meant something very different. Imagine you're extremely thirsty. You drink cold water. The pleasure doesn't come from luxury. It comes from removing pain. For Epicurus, the highest pleasure wasn't intense excitement. It was the absence of suffering. He called this state tranquility. A calm mind, a healthy body, freedom from unnecessary desires. That was happiness. Epicurus divided desires into three groups. Some are natural and necessary: food, shelter, friendship. Without them, life becomes difficult. Some are natural, but unnecessary: luxury foods, expensive clothes, comfort beyond necessity, enjoyable, but not essential. Then there are vain desires: power, unlimited wealth, fame, endless status. These have no natural limit. The more you chase them, the more dissatisfied you become. Epicurus believed much human misery comes from confusing wants with needs. Epicureans summarized their philosophy in four simple ideas. Do not fear the gods. Do not fear death. What is good is easy to obtain. What is terrible is usually easy to endure. This became known as the tetrapharmakos, the four-part cure, a medicine for anxiety. Perhaps Epicurus' most famous argument concerns death. He reasoned, when we exist, death is absent. When death arrives, we no longer exist. So, there is never a moment when both you and death coexist. Therefore, death cannot be experienced. Why fear something you will never experience? This argument has challenged philosophers for over 2,000 years. Epicurus did not deny the possibility that gods existed, but he believed, if perfect beings existed, they would have no reason to interfere in human affairs. Storms weren't punishments, diseases weren't divine anger, nature followed its own laws. People should stop living in constant fear of supernatural punishment. He died in 270 BC, leaving behind one of history's most influential philosophical movements. Imagine losing everything in a single day: your business, your savings, your possessions, your plans for the future. For most people, such an event would mark the beginning of despair. For Zeno of Citium, it marked the beginning of philosophy. Whether every detail of the famous shipwreck story is historically accurate is impossible to know. Ancient biographies often mixed fact with legend, but even if the story has been embellished over the centuries, it captures something undeniably true about Zeno's philosophy. Sometimes, losing control over the outside world forces us to discover control over ourselves. After the shipwreck, Zeno eventually found himself in Athens, the intellectual capital of the Greek world. Legend says he wandered into a bookseller's shop, where he began reading Xenophon's Memorabilia, one of the great accounts of Socrates' life. He was fascinated. When he finished reading, he reportedly asked the bookseller a simple question: "Where can I find a man like this?" Almost at that very moment, the cynic philosopher Crates happened to be walking past the shop. The bookseller pointed toward him and replied, "Follow that man." Whether or not the story happened exactly this way hardly matters. Its symbolism is beautiful. The man who had lost everything was now beginning a journey that would eventually influence emperors, generals, psychologists, and millions of ordinary people across more than 2,000 years. Unlike many philosophers, Zeno didn't immediately establish his own system. He became a student again. He studied with the Cynics, who believed happiness required rejecting luxury and social conventions. He learned from the Megarians, famous for their logical arguments. He absorbed ideas from followers of Plato and Aristotle. For nearly 20 years, he listened, questioned, compared, and reflected. Only then did he begin teaching his own philosophy. His classroom wasn't an academy or a private garden. Instead, he taught beneath a long-painted colonnade in the Athenian marketplace known as the Stoa Poikile, or their painted porch. From that simple location came the name of an entire philosophical movement: Stoicism. Epicurus had offered people a comforting vision of life. Reduce unnecessary desires, value friendship, avoid political turmoil, seek tranquility. It was wise advice. But Zeno noticed something. Epicurus' peace still depended, at least to some degree, on favorable circumstances: a peaceful garden, supportive friends, basic security. But what if those disappeared? Suppose war destroyed your home. Suppose illness took your health. Suppose death claimed those you loved. Could happiness survive then? If not, then happiness remained fragile. Zeno wanted something stronger. a philosophy capable of surviving catastrophe itself. Imagine two people standing in the middle of a violent storm. Neither controls the weather, neither controls the wind, neither controls the rain, yet one remains calm while the other falls into panic. Why? The difference, Zeno argued, isn't the storm, it's the response. This observation became one of Stoicism's central insights. Some things are within our control, many things are not. Our opinions, our choices, our intentions, these belong to us. Our reputation, other people's behavior, the economy, politics, disease, death, these do not. Most human suffering arises because we spend enormous energy trying to control things that were never ours to control in the first place. The Stoic solution wasn't indifference. It was clarity. Direct your effort toward what depends on you. Accept what does not. Simple to say, extraordinarily difficult to practice. Modern readers often misunderstand what the Stoics meant when they urged people to live according to nature. They weren't saying, go live in the forest, nor were they suggesting that every natural impulse should be followed. They meant something deeper. Human beings possess reason. Reason is part of our nature. Therefore, living well means allowing reason, not fear, anger, greed, or uncontrolled desire, to guide our actions. Suppose someone insults you. Your first impulse may be anger. Your reason asks, will anger improve this situation? If not, why surrender control of your peace to another person's words? For the Stoics, freedom wasn't doing whatever you felt like doing. Freedom meant no longer becoming a slave to every passing emotion. This is perhaps the boldest claim Stoicism ever made. The only thing that is truly good is virtue. Everything else is secondary. Health is desirable, but it isn't true goodness. Wealth is useful, but it isn't true goodness. Success is pleasant, but it isn't true goodness. Because all of those things can be taken away, character cannot. The ancient Greeks usually thought of themselves primarily as citizens of individual city-states. Athens, Sparta, Corinth. Loyalty rarely extended much further. The Stoics proposed something radically different. Every human being belongs to a single universal community. We are citizens of the world. Today we call this cosmopolitanism. The idea seems almost ordinary now. In Zeno's time, it was revolutionary. It suggested that all human beings share a common rational nature regardless of nationality, wealth, or social status. Centuries later, this idea would profoundly influence Roman law, Christianity, and eventually modern ideas of universal human rights. Although Zeno himself wrote many books, almost all of them have disappeared. Ironically, one of history's most influential philosophers survives largely through his students and later Stoic writers. His school flourished for centuries. It spread from Greece into Rome. There it reached figures such as Seneca, Epictetus, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. These Roman Stoics would eventually preserve and popularize many of Zeno's ideas long after his own writings had vanished. As centuries passed, the Greek world itself transformed once again. Rome rose to power. Traditional religions mixed with new spiritual movements. People increasingly searched not only for ethical guidance, but for a path toward ultimate reality itself. The next great philosopher would argue that beneath the changing world lies a single, infinite source from which everything flows. His philosophy would bridge the ancient Greek tradition with Christianity, Islam, and medieval thought. His name was Plotinus. Plotinus was born around 204 CE, probably in Roman Egypt. Strangely, despite becoming one of history's greatest philosophers, he rarely spoke about his own life. His student Porphyry tells us that Plotinus was almost embarrassed by having a physical body. When asked about his birthday, he refused to celebrate it. When artists wanted to paint his portrait, he declined. According to Porphyry, Plotinus reportedly said, "Isn't it enough that I must carry this image nature has wrapped around me? Must I also leave behind another image of this image?" Whether those were his exact words or not, they reveal something essential. Plotinus believed our deepest identity was not our body, nor even our personality. There was something far more fundamental within us, and philosophy existed to rediscover it. When Plotinus arrived in Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the Roman world, he became the student of a mysterious philosopher named Ammonius Saccas. Very little is known about Ammonius. He wrote nothing. Like Socrates centuries earlier, his influence survived almost entirely through his students. For more than a decade, Plotinus studied under him. Eventually, he traveled east, hoping to learn from Persian and Indian thinkers as well. Political conflict interrupted those plans, and he eventually settled in Rome. There he opened his own philosophical school. Although Plotinus admired Aristotle and respected the Stoics, it was Plato who remained his greatest inspiration. Yet Plotinus didn't simply repeat Plato's ideas. He transformed them. His philosophy became so distinctive that later historians gave it a new name: Neoplatonism. Not because it rejected Plato, but because it carried Plato's vision in an entirely new direction. Imagine asking yourself a deceptively simple question: where did everything come from? Science today might describe the Big Bang. Ancient religions offered creation stories. Greek philosophers proposed different first principles. Plotinus answered differently. At the foundation of reality exists something he simply called the One. Notice he didn't call it a god in the ordinary sense. The One isn't merely the most powerful being. It isn't one object among many. It isn't even a being. According to Plotinus, it is beyond all categories, beyond language, beyond thought, beyond existence itself as we normally understand it. Anything we say about it immediately becomes inadequate. Imagine the sun. It radiates light constantly. The sunlight fills the world. Yet the sun itself loses nothing by shining. Plotinus believed reality unfolds in something like this way. Everything that exists flows from the One, not because the One decides to create, but because perfect fullness naturally overflows. From the One emerges divine intellect. From intellect emerges soul. From soul emerges the physical universe. This process is known as emanation. If everything comes from the One, why do human beings feel so divided? Why do we experience conflict, fear, loneliness? Plotinus believed the answer lies in our attention. We become absorbed in the external world. We identify ourselves entirely with possessions, status, physical appearance, success, failure. Gradually, we forget our true origin. Imagine someone becoming so fascinated by shadows that they forget the existence of the sun. That, Plotinus believed, is the human condition. Our souls have become distracted. Philosophy is the journey home. Unlike many earlier philosophers, Plotinus didn't believe philosophy ended with logical argument. Reason is necessary. But eventually reason reaches its limit. Beyond that lies contemplation, inner transformation, the purification of the soul. His goal wasn't simply to understand reality intellectually. It was to experience union with the One itself. According to Porphyry, Plotinus achieved this mystical union several times during his lifetime. One aspect of Plotinus' philosophy has often been misunderstood. He frequently described matter as the lowest level of reality. Some later readers concluded that he believed the physical world was evil. That isn't quite accurate. Matter itself isn't evil. Rather, evil is understood as the absence of goodness. Much like darkness is not a substance but simply the absence of light. The further something exists from the One, the less complete it becomes. This idea profoundly shaped later religious thought, especially Christianity. His writings became the bridge connecting ancient Greek philosophy with the religious traditions that would dominate the Middle Ages. Christian thinkers found his concept of a transcendent source deeply compelling. Jewish philosophers adapted many of his ideas. Islamic philosophers studied him extensively. Even philosophers who rejected Neoplatonism often borrowed its vocabulary. Without Plotinus, medieval philosophy would look dramatically different. Perhaps even unimaginable. Plotinus spoke beautifully about ascending toward ultimate reality, about mystical union, about eternal truths. Yet one practical question remained. How should ordinary people actually live? How should someone struggling with temptation, guilt, political chaos, or personal failure conduct daily life? At almost the same moment the Roman Empire itself seemed to be losing its stability, another thinker began asking those very questions. Unlike Plotinus, this man knew moral failure intimately. He had spent much of his youth chasing ambition, pleasure, and worldly success. Only after years of inner conflict did he discover the philosophy and faith that transformed his life. His name was Augustine. And through him, Greek philosophy would enter the Christian world forever. Augustine was born in 354 CE in North Africa, in the Roman town of Thagast. His father remained a pagan for most of his life. His mother, Monica, was a deeply devoted Christian. According to tradition, Monica spent years praying that her brilliant but rebellious son would eventually embrace the faith she cherished. At first, those prayers appeared unanswered. Young Augustine possessed an extraordinary intellect. He excelled in rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. Like many ambitious young men, he dreamed of fame, success, and recognition. He loved literature. He admired eloquence. He pursued pleasure with remarkable enthusiasm. Years later, Augustine looked back on his youth with both affection and regret. In one of the most famous opening lines ever written, he would later confess, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That single sentence captures the central theme of his entire philosophy. Human beings search endlessly for fulfillment. But nothing finite ever completely satisfies them. Throughout his life, Augustine would later describe this feeling with remarkable honesty. No matter what he achieved, satisfaction never seemed to last. Every accomplishment was followed by another desire. Every pleasure eventually faded. The more he searched for fulfillment in the outside world, the more restless he became inside. The human heart, he argued, is searching for God, even when it doesn't realize it. Augustine's journey toward philosophy was anything but straightforward. As a young student, he became fascinated by a religious movement known as Manichaeism. Its teachings offered what seemed like a satisfying explanation for one of humanity's oldest questions: why does evil exist? The Manichaeans claimed the universe is a battlefield between two equal and eternal powers, one completely good, the other completely evil. At first, Augustine found this idea convincing. After all, doesn't the world often seem divided between light and darkness? Good people suffer. Cruel people prosper. War, disease, injustice, and death appear almost woven into the fabric of existence. Perhaps, Augustine thought, evil really is an independent force battling against goodness. For nearly a decade, he remained committed to this view. Then the questions began. If good and evil are equally powerful, why should either ever triumph? If evil exists independently, who created it? And if no one created it, how can reality possess two ultimate beginnings? Gradually, Augustine became dissatisfied. The explanation that once seemed convincing no longer satisfied his restless mind. He continued searching. While living in Milan, Augustine encountered Latin translations of Plotinus and other Neoplatonic thinkers. Their influence was immediate. Plotinus helped Augustine imagine God not as a physical being somewhere in the universe, but as the eternal source of all existence itself. He also encountered another revolutionary idea. Evil may not be a thing at all. Remember Plotinus' analogy. Darkness is not a substance. It is simply the absence of light. Augustine realized the same could be true of evil. Perhaps evil doesn't possess its own independent existence. Perhaps it is the absence, or corruption, of goodness. Imagine a healthy tree. Disease doesn't create a new kind of tree. It damages what already exists. Likewise, lies distort truth. Hatred corrupts love. Injustice twists justice. Evil, Augustine concluded, is not something God created. It is the result of goodness becoming disordered. This idea would become one of the most influential responses to the problem of evil in the entire history of Western philosophy. Despite these intellectual discoveries, Augustine remained deeply conflicted. His mind was changing. His habits were not. Years later, in his masterpiece Confessions, he described the struggle with remarkable vulnerability. He wanted to change. Yet another part of him resisted. He famously prayed, "Grant me chastity and self-control, but not yet." It is one of the most human moments in philosophical literature. Then came the moment that changed his life. One afternoon, overwhelmed by inner conflict, Augustine sat weeping beneath a tree. As he struggled with his thoughts, he heard the voice of a child singing nearby. "Take and read. Take and read." Taking the words as a sign, Augustine opened a copy of Paul's letters almost at random. The passage he encountered urged readers to abandon lives devoted to selfish desires and instead pursue a transformed way of living. According to Augustine, the effect was immediate. Years of inner conflict suddenly gave way to clarity. He abandoned his ambitions for political prestige. He gave away much of his wealth. Eventually, he was baptized and later became bishop of the North African city of Hippo. His search for truth had found its destination. If evil is merely the corruption of goodness, how does that corruption happen? Augustine answered with another powerful idea: free will. God, he argued, created human beings capable of genuine choice. Without freedom, love would be impossible. After all, forced love is not really love at all. But freedom carries risk. The same freedom that allows kindness also permits cruelty. The same freedom that enables generosity allows selfishness. God created free beings. Human beings misuse that freedom. Evil enters the world not because goodness failed, but because freedom was real. Then history intervened. In the year 410 CE, something happened that shocked the ancient world. The city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. For centuries, Romans had believed their empire was virtually eternal. Now even Rome itself appeared vulnerable. Panic spread across the empire. Many blamed Christianity. They argued that abandoning the old Roman gods had weakened the empire. Augustine responded by writing one of the most important books in political philosophy, The City of God. Augustine argued that throughout history, two symbolic cities have existed side by side: the earthly city and the city of God. The earthly city is built upon pride, power, self-interest, political ambition. It seeks glory that eventually fades. The city of God is built upon love directed toward what is eternal. It is not identical with any earthly kingdom, not even the church itself. Rather, it represents all those whose ultimate loyalty lies beyond temporary political powers. This distinction transformed Christian political thought for centuries. Very few thinkers have shaped Western civilization as profoundly as Augustine. For nearly 1,000 years, Christian theology developed largely within the framework he established. Augustine showed that faith and reason could work together. Yet many of his conclusions depended heavily upon religious revelation. As the centuries passed, scholars began wondering: could philosophy demonstrate these truths through reason alone? Could careful logical argument support beliefs about God, morality, and human nature without relying entirely on scripture? The challenge became even greater as Europe rediscovered the long-forgotten writings of Aristotle. His emphasis on observation and logic seemed, at first glance, very different from Augustine's deeply Platonic worldview. Was it possible to unite them? One medieval scholar believed it was. He would spend his entire life attempting to reconcile Athens with Jerusalem, reason with faith, Aristotle with Christianity. His name was Thomas Aquinas. Thomas Aquinas was born around 1225 in the Kingdom of Sicily into a wealthy noble family. From the moment he entered the world, his future seemed carefully planned. His parents expected him to become the abbot of the great monastery at Monte Cassino. It would have been a position of tremendous prestige, influence, and security. Young Thomas, however, had other plans. As a student at the University of Naples, he encountered the recently founded Dominican order. Unlike wealthy monks living in established monasteries, the Dominicans traveled, preached, studied, and often embraced voluntary poverty. Thomas was deeply impressed. He decided to join them. His family was horrified. To his aristocratic relatives, this decision looked like throwing away a brilliant career. According to tradition, they even kidnapped him and kept him confined for nearly a year, hoping he would abandon his decision. Nothing worked. Thomas remained determined. Eventually, his family gave up. The quiet young nobleman became a Dominican friar. History would never be the same. When Thomas later studied under the famous scholar Albertus Magnus, he rarely spoke during lectures. Other students mistook his silence for lack of intelligence. Some mockingly nicknamed him the dumb ox. Albertus saw something entirely different. He reportedly told the students, "You call him a dumb ox, but his bellowing will one day fill the whole world." Whether those exact words were spoken is uncertain. But history certainly proved the prediction accurate. Thomas would eventually write millions of words. His works remain among the most influential in philosophy and theology. To understand Aquinas, remember where philosophy stood after Augustine. Augustine had shown how Plato's ideas could enrich Christian thought. But now Aristotle had returned. For centuries, much of Aristotle's work had been virtually unknown in Western Europe. Now, thanks largely to Muslim and Jewish scholars who had preserved and commented upon the ancient texts, Europe was rediscovering one of history's greatest philosophers. And Aristotle asked different questions. Instead of beginning with divine revelation, Aristotle began with observation. Instead of looking primarily toward eternal forms, he examined the natural world. Could these two traditions coexist? Many believed they could not. Thomas disagreed. Truth, he argued, cannot contradict truth. If both reason and revelation ultimately come from God, then genuine discoveries in philosophy cannot conflict with genuine religious truth. Whenever they appear to conflict, human beings have misunderstood one or the other. This simple conviction became the foundation of Aquinas' entire intellectual project. Reason allows us to discover many truths about reality through observation and logic. Revelation discloses truths that reason alone could never fully uncover. The two are not competitors. They are partners. This was an enormously optimistic view of human reason. Perhaps no aspect of Aquinas' philosophy is more famous than his 5 ways. They are philosophical arguments attempting to show that belief in God is reasonable. Let's briefly explore them. Aristotle had observed that everything in motion is moved by something else. A falling stone moves because gravity acts upon it. A cart moves because a horse pulls it. A horse moves because its muscles contract. Trace every chain of motion backward, Aquinas argued, and eventually we arrive at a first mover, a source of motion that is not itself moved by anything else. This first mover is what he identifies as God. Every event appears to have a cause. A tree grows from a seed. The seed comes from another tree. That tree grew from another seed. Can this chain of causes continue backward forever? Aquinas thought not. He argued that an endless regress of causes cannot adequately explain why anything exists at all. Therefore, there must ultimately be a first cause. Look around. Everything you see might not have existed. Trees die. People are born and eventually pass away. Stars form and eventually collapse. Everything appears contingent, dependent. If everything could possibly fail to exist, why does anything exist now? Aquinas concluded that there must exist one necessary being whose existence does not depend upon anything else. We naturally compare things. One painting is more beautiful than another. One act is more courageous. One person is wiser. According to Aquinas, such comparisons suggest some ultimate standard by which lesser degrees are measured. That perfect standard, he argued, is God. Even non-conscious objects often behave in remarkably ordered ways. Seeds consistently grow into the plants they are capable of becoming. The natural world displays astonishing regularity. Aquinas argued that such directed order suggests an intelligent source, not unlike an arrow reaching its target because it was aimed. Together, these became known as the 5 ways. For centuries they dominated philosophical discussions about the existence of God. Thomas spent much of his life writing what became his greatest masterpiece, the Summa Theologica. It wasn't merely a book. It was an encyclopedia of philosophy and theology. Nearly every major question imaginable appeared within its pages. Does God exist? What is virtue? What are angels? What is justice? Why does evil exist? What makes laws legitimate? What is happiness? What makes the Summa remarkable is its structure. Thomas rarely presented only his own opinion. Instead, he carefully summarized opposing arguments first. Often he expressed his opponent's positions so fairly that readers could almost believe he agreed with them. Only then did he explain why he believed they were mistaken. This method reflected profound intellectual humility. Near the end of his life, something unexpected happened. While celebrating Mass in December 1273, Thomas underwent an intense spiritual experience. Whatever occurred affected him deeply. Afterward, he almost completely stopped writing. His secretary urged him to continue the Summa. Thomas reportedly replied, "I can write no more. All that I have written seems like straw compared with what has been revealed to me." He died only a few months later, leaving the Summa unfinished. Around that time, the Renaissance slowly approached. Human beings became increasingly interested not only in heaven, but in earthly politics. How should rulers actually govern? Could moral ideals survive in the brutal struggle for power? Or was politics a world governed by entirely different rules? The next great philosopher would shock Europe by answering those questions with ruthless honesty. He rarely described the world as it ought to be. Instead, he described it as he believed it truly was. His name was NICCOLO Machiavelli. When Machiavelli was born in Florence in 1469, Italy was not a united country. Instead, it was a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states: Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, the Papal States. Each competed for wealth, influence, and survival. To make matters worse, powerful foreign kingdoms, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, constantly interfered in Italian politics. Machiavelli was not born into great wealth. His family belonged to the educated middle class. He received an excellent education in history, literature, and classical Latin. Yet unlike many philosophers before him, Machiavelli spent much of his life inside government rather than inside schools. At the age of 29, he became a senior official in the Florentine Republic. For 14 years, he carried out diplomatic missions across Europe. He negotiated with kings, met military commanders, observed ambitious rulers, and witnessed political power operating behind the scenes. These experiences became his true university. Instead of imagining how rulers behaved, he watched them. He observed their successes, their failures, their betrayals, their victories. Few philosophers before him had enjoyed such direct access to their machinery of power. Among all the rulers Machiavelli encountered, one left an especially powerful impression: Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI. Borgia possessed nearly everything that frightened and fascinated Renaissance Europe: charm, intelligence, military skill, ruthlessness. He united territories through both diplomacy and violence. Machiavelli watched him carefully. He admired neither cruelty nor bloodshed for their own sake. What fascinated him was effectiveness. Why did some rulers succeed while others failed? Could political success be studied scientifically? This question eventually became the heart of his most famous book. After years of public service, Florence's government collapsed. The powerful Medici family returned to power. Because Machiavelli had served the previous republic, he immediately fell under suspicion. He was arrested, accused of conspiracy, imprisoned. According to historical accounts, he was tortured. Eventually he was released. But freedom came with a condition: exile. Suddenly, the experienced diplomat found himself unemployed, politically irrelevant, and living on a small farm outside Florence. For many people, such a downfall would have marked the end of their career. For Machiavelli, it became the beginning of his legacy. Cut off from politics, Machiavelli began writing. Not because he wanted fame. He hoped the Medici rulers would read his work and restore him to government service. The result became one of the most controversial books ever written. The Prince. Even today, describing someone as Machiavellian usually means they are manipulative, dishonest, or ruthlessly ambitious. But Machiavelli himself was asking a much more complicated question. Why do states collapse? Why do rulers lose power? And what qualities actually enable governments to survive? One sentence captures Machiavelli's approach better than almost any other. He argued that many writers describe imaginary republics and ideal rulers that have never existed. Machiavelli believed political thinkers had spent too much time describing ideal governments while ignoring human nature as it truly is. People, he argued, are often selfish, fearful, ambitious, grateful today, forgetful tomorrow. A ruler who ignores these realities governs at enormous risk. Perhaps no sentence from The Prince is more famous than this. Is it better for a ruler to be loved or feared? Machiavelli's answer surprises many readers. Ideally, both. But if forced to choose, fear is generally more reliable. Notice what he does not say. He does not recommend pointless cruelty. He repeatedly warns rulers against becoming hated. Hatred destroys governments. Fear, however, can produce stability when used carefully. Another of Machiavelli's most important ideas concerns the relationship between luck and ability. He believed human affairs are shaped partly by fortune, wars, natural disasters, unexpected events. No ruler controls everything. But fortune controls only part of life. The rest depends upon what Machiavelli called virtù. Imagine two leaders facing the same crisis. One hesitates. The other adapts immediately. Both experience identical fortune. Their outcomes differ because of their virtù. Political science gradually separated itself from theology and moral philosophy partly because Machiavelli insisted on studying politics empirically. His method proved enormously powerful. Yet one question remained. If observation works so well in politics, why not apply the same approach to nature itself? For centuries, scholars had relied heavily upon ancient authorities. Aristotle said this. Pliny wrote that. Galen believed something else. But what if the ancient authorities were mistaken? What if knowledge should begin not with books, but with experiments? The next philosopher would challenge centuries of inherited assumptions. Instead of asking people merely to think differently, he asked them to investigate the world for themselves. His name was Francis Bacon. Francis Bacon was born in London in 1561 during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. England was transforming. Bacon grew up believing that humanity stood at the beginning of a completely new chapter in history. Unlike many thinkers who admired the past above all else, Bacon believed the future could surpass it. Not because modern people were naturally smarter, but because knowledge accumulates. Each generation can build upon the discoveries of those before it. Perhaps no sentence associated with Bacon has become more famous than this: knowledge is power. The phrase appears so often today that it almost sounds like a motivational slogan. For Bacon, however, it carried a much deeper meaning. He believed the purpose of knowledge was not simply contemplation. Knowledge should improve human life. Knowledge, Bacon argued, is valuable precisely because it enables humanity to act more wisely. Philosophy should not remain an intellectual game. It should become useful. Yet before humanity could understand nature, it first had to confront an uncomfortable truth. The greatest obstacle to knowledge might not be nature itself. It might be the human mind. We often assume we see reality clearly. Bacon disagreed. He believed our minds constantly deceive us. Not intentionally, simply because they are human. To explain this, Bacon introduced one of his most original ideas: the idols of the mind. These were not religious idols. They were mental habits that distort our understanding of reality. The first are the idols of the tribe. These arise simply because we are human. Our minds naturally look for patterns, even when no real pattern exists. Imagine seeing shapes in clouds, or believing that a streak of lucky events guarantees future success. Our brains constantly search for meaning. Sometimes they discover genuine patterns. Sometimes they invent them. Bacon warned that human nature itself can become an obstacle to objective thinking. The second are the idols of the cave. Each individual grows up inside a unique cave. Our family, education, culture, experiences, personal preferences. These shape how we interpret the world. Bacon argued that every mind carries hidden biases. Recognizing them is the first step toward overcoming them. Next come the idols of the marketplace. These arise through language itself. Words often create confusion instead of clarity. Think about how frequently people argue passionately, only to discover they were defining the same word differently. Language can simplify reality, but it can also distort it. Poorly chosen words produce poorly framed questions, and poorly framed questions rarely produce good answers. Finally, there are the idols of the theater. These are entire systems of thought accepted simply because respected authorities taught them. Imagine actors performing a play on stage. The audience temporarily accepts the performance as reality. Similarly, Bacon believed philosophical systems sometimes become intellectual theaters. Beautiful, elegant, persuasive, yet disconnected from the actual world. He wasn't attacking philosophy itself. He was warning against blind loyalty to any system. Every theory should ultimately answer to evidence, not reputation, not tradition, not authority. If the mind is naturally biased, how can we discover reliable knowledge? Bacon proposed a new approach: observation, experiment, careful comparison, repeated testing. Instead of beginning with grand theories and searching for evidence to support them, begin with evidence. Collect facts patiently. Allow conclusions to emerge gradually. This method became known as induction. Bacon believed humanity needed nothing less than a complete reconstruction of knowledge. He called this ambitious project the Great Instauration. The name itself reveals his optimism. He genuinely believed civilization could enter a new era of discovery. Universities should encourage experimentation. Scientists should collaborate rather than compete. Knowledge should accumulate generation after generation. Instead of endlessly repeating ancient authorities, humanity should continually expand its understanding of nature. History sometimes possesses an unusual sense of irony. One winter day, Bacon became curious about whether snow might preserve meat. Rather than simply speculate, he decided to test the idea himself. He reportedly purchased a chicken, stuffed it with snow, and observed the results. The experiment succeeded. The meat remained preserved. Unfortunately, Bacon caught pneumonia during the process. A few days later, he died. The philosopher who spent his life encouraging experiments may have died conducting one. He persuaded generations of thinkers that careful observation and systematic experimentation could unlock nature's deepest secrets. Modern medicine, engineering, technology, chemistry, biology. In different ways, all inherited something from Bacon's vision. But another philosopher soon raised an uncomfortable objection. How can we trust our observations? Our senses sometimes deceive us. A straight stick appears bent in water. Dreams can feel completely real. Optical illusions fool us effortlessly. If our senses can mislead us, then what foundation remains absolutely certain? The next philosopher decided to doubt everything. Not because he loved skepticism, but because he hoped to discover one truth that could never be doubted. From that single certainty, he believed all knowledge could be rebuilt. His name was René Descartes. Descartes was born in France in 1596, just as Europe stood on the edge of enormous change. The scientific revolution had begun. As a young man, he traveled widely and even served as a soldier. Those journeys exposed him to different customs, different beliefs, and different ways of thinking. Each culture believes it possesses the truth, yet they cannot all be correct. How, then, can anyone know what is genuinely certain? That question never left him. According to Descartes' own account, in 1619 he experienced a series of vivid dreams while staying in Germany. He later interpreted these dreams as a sign that he had been called to devote his life to discovering a universal method for finding truth. Most philosophers begin by asking, "What do we know?" Descartes asked something much stranger. What if everything I believe is false? Every belief would face the strongest possible skepticism. If even the slightest reason for doubt remained, the belief would be temporarily rejected. Not forever. The first target was obvious: our senses. After all, our senses sometimes deceive us. A stick appears bent when partially submerged in water. The sun seems to travel across the sky, even though the earth rotates. A distant mountain appears blue. Mirages create water where none exists. If the senses occasionally deceive us, should we trust them completely? Probably not. Descartes concluded that sensory knowledge alone could never provide absolute certainty. Then his skepticism became even more radical. Think about your last dream. While dreaming, events often seem perfectly real. You speak with people, walk through cities, experience joy, fear, excitement. Only after waking do you realize none of it happened. But while dreaming, you were convinced it was reality. Descartes asked a disturbing question. How do you know you aren't dreaming right now? Most people instinctively answer, because it feels real. Exactly. Dreams often feel real too. Descartes wasn't trying to prove life is a dream. He was showing how difficult certainty actually is. Descartes doubted the senses. He doubted the external world. He doubted mathematics. He even imagined universal deception. Yet something remarkable happened. One fact remained impossible to doubt. The very act of doubting proved something. If I doubt, someone must be doing the doubting. If I think, someone must be thinking. From this realization came one of the most famous sentences ever written. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He knows only one thing with certainty. There is a thinking self. Everything else must be rebuilt from there. Having discovered one undeniable truth, Descartes began reconstructing knowledge. He argued that some ideas appear so clear and distinct that they carry a certainty similar to the cogito. Among these, he believed, was the idea of a perfect God. His reasoning went roughly like this. Human beings are imperfect. Yet we possess the concept of perfection. Where could such an idea originate? An imperfect being cannot create the idea of absolute perfection entirely from itself. Therefore, Descartes concluded, the idea must ultimately come from a genuinely perfect being. Perhaps no idea associated with Descartes has generated more debate than his distinction between mind and body. He argued that the mind and the body are fundamentally different kinds of things. The body occupies space. It has weight, shape, movement. The mind does not. Thought has no physical dimensions. You cannot weigh an idea, measure a memory, or place love inside a container. This became known as mind-body dualism. The human being, according to Descartes, is the mysterious union of these two distinct realities. Immediately another question appeared. How do mind and body interact? If thoughts are not physical, how do they cause physical actions? When you decide to raise your hand, how does that decision move your muscles? Descartes struggled with this problem himself, proposing that the interaction somehow occurred through the pineal gland deep within the brain. Descartes admired mathematics more than almost any other discipline. Mathematics, unlike ordinary perception, seemed capable of delivering certainty. He dreamed of applying mathematical precision to philosophy itself. His influence extended far beyond philosophy. He also revolutionized mathematics by helping create analytic geometry. Today, every time students graph equations using an x-axis and y-axis, they unknowingly use the Cartesian coordinate system that bears his name. Descartes trusted reason above almost everything else. Careful thinking, he believed, could reveal the deepest truths about reality. Yet another philosopher looked at human beings and reached a very different conclusion. He believed people were not naturally rational creatures. They were driven by fear, desire, competition, and the instinct to survive. Instead of beginning with the thinking individual, he began with society itself. What happens when no government exists? Would reason guide humanity? Or would civilization collapse into violence? The man who asked those unsettling questions had lived through one of England's bloodiest civil wars. His answer would become one of the foundations of modern political philosophy. His name was Thomas Hobbes. He was born prematurely in 1588, the same year that Spain's mighty Armada threatened to invade England. Later he famously remarked, "Fear and I were born twins." Whether entirely literal or slightly exaggerated, the remark captured something essential about his philosophy. Fear, Hobbes believed, is one of the most powerful forces shaping human life. Especially the fear of violent death. That single insight would become the foundation of his political philosophy. To understand Hobbes, we must understand the world around him. 17th century England was descending into political chaos. Tensions between the monarchy and parliament grew steadily worse. Religious conflict divided communities. Eventually, disagreement turned into civil war. Then came something almost unimaginable. In 1649, King Charles I was publicly executed. For centuries, European monarchs had claimed to rule by divine authority. Now an English king had been tried and beheaded by his own people. Hobbes watched these events unfold with horror. Unlike philosophers who imagined ideal republics from a distance, Hobbes witnessed firsthand what political breakdown actually looked like. For him, chaos was not an abstract possibility. It was reality. Many philosophers begin with an optimistic view of humanity. People are naturally good, naturally cooperative, naturally reasonable. Hobbes disagreed. Not because he believed people are monsters, but because he believed they are remarkably similar. Imagine two travelers discovering the same source of food in a wilderness. If enough exists for both, there is no problem. But what if only one can survive? Suddenly cooperation becomes much more difficult. Hobbes argued that human beings possess roughly equal abilities. Even the strongest person can be killed while sleeping. Even the weakest may defeat the strongest through planning or alliances. Because no one is completely secure, everyone has reason to fear everyone else. This equality, paradoxically, produces conflict. Now Hobbes invites us into his most famous thought experiment. Imagine humanity before governments existed. This condition he called the state of nature. Notice that this is not necessarily a historical description. He wasn't claiming civilization literally began this way. Instead, he asked us to imagine what human relationships would become without any common authority. In such a world, everyone possesses complete freedom. You may take whatever you can seize. Defend yourself however you choose. Trust no one unless absolutely necessary. Agreements remain fragile because no authority exists to enforce them. Eventually, suspicion grows. People strike first because they fear being attacked first. Violence spreads not because everyone enjoys cruelty, but because insecurity encourages preemptive action. From this reasoning came Hobbes' most famous description. Life in the state of nature would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. According to Hobbes, three forces drive human conflict: competition. People fight for resources. Diffidence, or mutual fear. People attack because they fear others may attack first. And glory. People seek reputation, respect, and honor. If the state of nature is so dangerous, how can people escape it? Hobbes' answer transformed political philosophy forever. The social contract. Imagine hundreds of individuals making the same agreement simultaneously. Each person says, in effect, I surrender part of my absolute freedom, provided everyone else does the same. Why? Because limited freedom inside a peaceful society is preferable to unlimited freedom inside permanent violence. Notice something important. The contract is not primarily between ruler and citizens. It is between citizens themselves. They collectively create political authority because doing so protects everyone. Government, therefore, exists not because kings possess divine rights, but because ordinary people need security. This was a revolutionary way of thinking. Once people establish political authority, Hobbes argued that authority must remain powerful. Otherwise society risks falling back into civil war. He called this sovereign power the Leviathan, borrowing the name of a gigantic sea creature from the Bible. The title was symbolic. Government must be strong enough to command obedience. Not because rulers are morally superior, but because weak governments invite chaos. Without effective authority, conflict gradually overwhelms cooperation. Hobbes admired the new scientific thinking emerging across Europe. He even knew Galileo personally during his travels. Inspired by the scientific revolution, Hobbes wanted to explain politics with the same precision scientists use to explain motion. Human beings, he believed, are physical creatures governed by desires and fears. Politics should therefore be studied scientifically. Not through wishful thinking. Not through idealism. But by carefully examining human behavior. In many respects, Hobbes attempted to create a science of politics. Another English philosopher believed Hobbes had misunderstood humanity. He agreed that governments exist through social agreement. But he rejected Hobbes' bleak view of human nature. Instead of fear, he placed his trust in liberty. His ideas would eventually inspire revolutions on both sides of the Atlantic. And modern democracy would never be quite the same. His name was John Locke.
Home, no more home to me, whither must I wander?
John Locke was born in 1632 into a country already drifting toward political turmoil. His father fought on the side of Parliament during the English Civil War. Locke studied at Oxford, where he quickly became frustrated with traditional education. Students spent endless hours debating ancient authorities, memoizing Aristotle, repeating old arguments. Very little attention was given to observation or experimentation. Like Bacon, Locke believed knowledge should begin with experience rather than inherited assumptions. But instead of asking how we discover the natural world, Locke asked something even more fundamental. How does the human mind acquire knowledge in the first place? For centuries, many philosophers believed human beings are born with certain ideas already implanted in the mind: truth, God, morality, reason. These ideas, they argued, exist naturally within us. Locke disagreed. Imagine a completely blank sheet of paper. No words. No drawings. No marks of any kind. That, Locke argued, is the human mind at birth. He called this idea tabula rasa, the blank slate. Every idea we possess enters through experience. Some arrive through our senses. We see colors, hear sounds, feel warmth, taste sweetness. Others arise when the mind reflects upon those experiences. Gradually, simple ideas combine into more complex ones. With this simple insight, Locke became one of the greatest representatives of empiricism. The belief that knowledge begins primarily through experience. Notice how different this approach is from Descartes. Descartes distrusted the senses. Locke trusted them. Not blindly. Certainly our senses sometimes deceive us. But without experience, Locke believed, the mind has nothing to think about in the first place. If Descartes built philosophy from reason, Locke built it from observation. This disagreement between rationalism and empiricism would dominate philosophy for generations. Like Hobbes, Locke imagined a state of nature. But his version looked dramatically different. Human beings, he argued, are naturally free and equal. Even before governments exist, people possess certain rights. These rights do not come from kings, or governments, or parliaments. They belong to every person simply because they are human. Locke identified three especially important ones: life, liberty, property. These became known as natural rights. Governments do not create rights. They exist to protect rights that already belong to individuals. Power now flows in the opposite direction. Instead of citizens existing for the state exists for its citizens. That single reversal changed political philosophy forever. Hobbes feared rebellion above almost everything else. Locke agreed that revolutions are dangerous. But he believed there are circumstances where they become morally justified. Suppose a ruler repeatedly imprisons innocent people, confiscates property without law, suppresses basic freedoms, ignores the rights government was created to protect. At that point, Locke argued, citizens possess not merely the right, but sometimes even the duty, to replace that government. These ideas would echo loudly across history. Almost a century later, American revolutionaries would quote Locke repeatedly. His influence appears unmistakably in the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson's famous phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, clearly reflects Locke's earlier formulation of life, liberty, and property. Europe during Locke's lifetime remained deeply divided by religious conflict. Catholics fought Protestants. Different Protestant groups fought one another. Governments often attempted to enforce religious conformity. Locke believed this approach was both morally wrong and politically disastrous. Faith, he argued, cannot be forced. A government may compel outward behavior. It cannot command genuine belief. Therefore, peaceful societies should tolerate different religious convictions. This argument became one of the intellectual foundations of modern religious liberty. At the same time, another issue remained unresolved. Locke spoke frequently about God. Yet many philosophers still imagined God as a distant ruler standing outside creation. What if that entire picture was mistaken? What if God was not separate from nature at all? What if the universe itself was the divine? The next philosopher would make exactly that claim. His name was Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza was born in Amsterdam in 1632. At first glance, Amsterdam seemed like the perfect place for an independent thinker. Compared with much of Europe, the Dutch Republic enjoyed an unusual degree of religious and commercial freedom. Ships arrived from every corner of the world. Merchants traded goods from Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Spinoza belonged to the Portuguese Jewish community. Many of its members had fled Spain and Portugal to escape the brutal religious persecutions of the Inquisition. They finally found safety in Amsterdam. Naturally, they valued religious unity. For a community that had survived centuries of persecution, preserving tradition felt essential. Into this world was born an exceptionally curious young man. As a child, Spinoza received an excellent education in Jewish philosophy, Hebrew scripture, and religious lore. His teachers recognized his remarkable intelligence. Many expected him to become a respected rabbi. Instead, he began asking uncomfortable questions. Questions about miracles. Questions about scripture. Questions about the nature of God. Questions that many people preferred not to ask aloud. Gradually, Spinoza's private doubts became impossible to ignore. In 1656, the community reached its decision. He was formally excommunicated. The document describing his expulsion remains one of the harshest ever issued against a philosopher. Unlike Galileo, who eventually reconciled with the Church, or Socrates, who defended himself before Athens, Spinoza simply walked away. He never returned. Excommunication left Spinoza with very little. To support himself, he learned an unusual trade: grinding lenses. Hour after hour, he carefully polished glass used in telescopes and microscopes. Most philosophers write in ordinary language. Spinoza chose something entirely different. His greatest work, Ethics, reads almost like a geometry textbook. Definitions, axioms, propositions, proofs, corollaries, scholiums. At first glance, it feels surprisingly dry. Why write philosophy this way? Because Spinoza admired mathematics. A geometric proof doesn't rely on emotion, or authority, or tradition. Its conclusions follow logically from its premises. Spinoza hoped philosophy could achieve the same certainty. Now we arrive at the heart of Spinoza's philosophy. He argued that beneath all apparent diversity lies only one ultimate substance. Everything else depends upon it. Everything else exists within it. Everything else is simply one expression of that infinite reality. He called this substance God, or nature. His most famous phrase captures the idea perfectly. God, or nature. Not God and nature. God or nature. Two names. One reality. For many people, the word God immediately brings to mind a powerful being who exists somewhere beyond the universe. Spinoza rejected that image completely. God is not a king sitting on a heavenly throne. God does not occasionally intervene in nature. Because God is not outside nature. Nature itself is the expression of God. Everything belongs to the same reality. Nothing exists outside it. If this infinite substance is so vast, how can human beings understand it? Spinoza argued that God, or nature, possesses infinitely many attributes. Each attribute expresses the essence of the one substance in a different way. Human beings, however, directly know only two. Thought. An extension. Extension refers to the physical universe. Bodies. Matter. Motion. Everything occupying space. Thought refers to ideas. Consciousness. Mind. Understanding. Now suppose you ask, if only one substance exists, what are individual objects? Spinoza called them modes. A mode is simply a temporary modification of the one infinite substance. We usually imagine ourselves as isolated individuals interacting with an external world. Spinoza believed separation itself is largely an illusion. Reality is profoundly interconnected. Imagine watching a leaf fall from a tree. Most people simply say, "The wind blew." Spinoza asks, what caused the wind? Then, what caused that cause? And what caused the cause before it? He believed everything in nature follows from previous causes with absolute necessity. Nothing happens without reason. The universe unfolds according to eternal laws. At this point, many people ask an obvious question. If everything is determined, where is freedom? Spinoza answered with one of his most surprising ideas. Freedom does not mean acting without causes. That, he argued, is impossible. Instead, freedom means understanding the causes that shape us. True freedom begins when understanding replaces ignorance. The more we understand ourselves, the less we become slaves to our passions. Perhaps no idea captures Spinoza's psychology better than the concept of conatus. Everything that exists strives to persist in its own existence. A tree grows toward sunlight. Animals struggle to survive. Human beings pursue what they believe will preserve and strengthen their lives. This striving is not accidental. It is the very essence of each thing. When this striving becomes conscious in human beings, Spinoza calls it desire. From this simple principle, he develops an entire philosophy of human emotions. Love, hatred, hope, fear, jealousy, pride. All emerge from our efforts to increase or protect our power to exist. Instead of condemning emotions, Spinoza sought to understand them. Because only what we understand can truly be transformed. What, then, is the highest form of happiness? For Spinoza, the highest human achievement is what he called the intellectual love of God. This does not mean emotional worship in the conventional religious sense. It means seeing reality clearly, understanding the universe as one interconnected whole, recognizing that we are expressions of that infinite reality rather than isolated individuals struggling against it. For Spinoza, enlightenment is not escaping nature. It is finally seeing ourselves as part of it. Spinoza built an astonishing vision of reality. A universe governed by necessity, perfect order, complete rationality. Everything followed logically from the nature of the one infinite substance. But another philosopher wondered, if reality is so perfectly rational, why does it contain so much diversity? And if everything follows necessity, where does individuality come from? The next philosopher believed he had an answer. He imagined reality as composed not of one substance, but of infinitely many simple entities working together in perfect harmony. His name was Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz.
Ich grolle nicht, und wenn das Herz auch bricht.
Leibniz was born in Leipzig, Germany, in 1646. His father, a professor of moral philosophy, died when Gottfried was only 6 years old. Fortunately, the family possessed an extraordinary library. While most children played outside, young Leibniz disappeared among books. By his early teens, he had taught himself Latin. Soon afterward, he learned Greek. He read Aristotle before most children finish elementary school. He devoured philosophy, mathematics, history, law, and theology with astonishing speed. Before returning to philosophy, we should pause for a moment to appreciate one of Leibniz's greatest achievements. Alongside Isaac Newton, he independently developed calculus. Unfortunately, this remarkable achievement became overshadowed by one of history's bitterest intellectual disputes. Who invented calculus first? Newton claimed priority. Leibniz insisted he had developed it independently. Ironically, the notation used in classrooms around the world today is largely Leibniz. Every time students write indefinite integral or dx, they unknowingly use symbols he invented over 3 centuries ago. Leibniz admired both Descartes and Spinoza. Yet he believed each had overlooked something essential. To explain his own philosophy, he introduced what became known as the principle of sufficient reason. Its basic claim sounds almost obvious. Nothing happens without a reason why it is so, rather than otherwise. Leibniz believed this principle applies not merely to everyday events, but to the entire universe. Why does anything exist instead of nothing? Why do physical laws possess their particular form? Why are you, rather than someone else? Every genuine fact, he believed, ultimately possesses an explanation, even if human beings have not yet discovered it. Leibniz proposed another fascinating principle. Suppose two objects possess absolutely every property in common. Same size, same shape, same history, same location, same relationships. No possible difference exists between them. Could they truly be two separate things? Leibniz answered no. If nothing distinguishes them, they are not two things. They are one. This became known as the identity of indiscernibles. At first, the idea sounds abstract. Yet it reveals something important about individuality. Every person, every leaf, every star, every grain of sand, occupies a unique place within reality. No two perspectives are ever completely identical. Each contributes something irreplaceable to the universe. Now we arrive at the most famous, and perhaps the most mysterious, part of Leibniz's philosophy. He rejected both Descartes' dualism and Spinoza's single substance. Instead, he proposed that reality consists of countless simple entities called monads. What exactly is a monad? That question puzzled readers even during Leibniz's lifetime. A monad is not an atom. It occupies no physical space. It cannot be divided. It possesses no shape. Instead, a monad is more like a center of perspective, a point of perception, a tiny mirror reflecting the entire universe from its own unique point of view. Imagine standing inside a massive cathedral filled with mirrors. Every mirror reflects the same building. Yet each reflection differs slightly depending upon its position. Similarly, every monad reflects the same universe, but each reflects it differently. You experience reality from your perspective. I experience it from mine. Every conscious being represents another window through which the universe observes itself. Then Leibniz made an even stranger claim. Monads never actually interact with one another. At first, this sounds impossible. Surely interaction has occurred. Leibniz argued that what appears to be interaction is actually something much deeper. He called it pre-established harmony. Imagine two perfectly synchronized clocks. Place them side by side. Every minute, both display identical times. One does not cause the other to move. They remain synchronized because someone designed them that way from the beginning. Leibniz believed God created every monad in precisely this manner. Each unfolds according to its own internal nature. Yet all remain perfectly coordinated. Perhaps no idea made Leibniz more famous, or more controversial, than his claim that this is the best of all possible worlds. Immediately, objections arise. What about war? Disease? Earthquakes? Injustice? Surely a better world could exist. Leibniz never denied the existence of suffering. Instead, he argued that God, being perfectly wise and perfectly good, would create the best overall reality possible. Leibniz believed finite human beings see only tiny fragments of an infinitely complex universe. What appears unnecessary from our limited perspective may contribute to a greater harmony we cannot yet perceive. Whether convincing or not, this argument became one of philosophy's most debated attempts to explain evil. Nearly 50 years after his death, the French writer Voltaire published the satirical novel Candide. Its main character repeatedly insists that everything happens for the best, even while witnessing war, disaster, cruelty, and unimaginable suffering. He was challenging Leibniz's belief that every event belongs to the best possible order. The debate between optimism and skepticism continues today. Leibniz dreamed of something extraordinary. He imagined creating a universal logical language capable of resolving disagreements through calculation. Suppose two philosophers argued. Instead of debating endlessly, they would simply perform the necessary logical operations. Leibniz famously imagined them saying, "Let us calculate." By the beginning of the 18th century, philosophy seemed remarkably confident. Descartes trusted reason. Spinoza revealed a perfectly rational universe. Leibniz argued that every event possesses sufficient reason and belongs to the best possible world. Many philosophers believed human reason was steadily approaching complete understanding. Then came a quiet Scottish thinker who asked one devastating question. How do you know any of this is true? Not, why do you believe it? But, what evidence do you actually have? If every idea ultimately comes from experience, can experience ever justify certainty? The philosopher who asked that question would shake the foundations of Western thought so deeply that one later philosopher confessed it awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. His name was David Hume. David Hume was born in Edinburgh, Scotland, in 1711. Unlike many earlier philosophers who came from wealthy or politically influential families, Hume lived a relatively modest life. His family hoped he would become a lawyer. Hume had other plans. Law failed to excite him. Philosophy did. History did. Literature did. The human mind fascinated him more than legal arguments ever could. He asked a brilliant question. Before we study the universe, shouldn't we first study the instrument doing the studying? That instrument is the human mind. If our understanding is limited, then every science ultimately depends upon understanding those limits. Hume therefore wanted to become something unusual. A scientist of human nature. Not by dissecting brains. Instead, he carefully examined how human beings actually think. Not how philosophers imagine they should think. Like John Locke, Hume believed knowledge begins with experience. But he pushed empiricism much further. He distinguished between two kinds of mental content. First come impressions. These are vivid experiences. Seeing a bright sunset. Feeling pain. Hearing music. Smelling fresh bread. Then come ideas. Ideas are simply weaker copies of impressions. Think about yesterday's breakfast. You can remember it. But the memory lacks the vividness of actually eating it. According to Hume, every legitimate idea ultimately traces back to some original experience. Now we arrive at one of the most famous arguments in philosophy. Imagine watching one billiard ball strike another. The first ball moves. It hits the second. The second begins rolling away. Most people immediately say, the first ball caused the second to move. Hume asks us to look more carefully. What did you actually observe? You saw one movement. Then another. You observed one event followed by another. But did you ever actually see the mysterious force called causation? No. You saw only constant succession. One event repeatedly following another. After seeing this happen thousands of times, your mind develops a habit. It expects the second event whenever the first appears. That expectation feels so natural that we mistake it for certainty. Yet, Hume argued, certainty never arrives. We assume the future will resemble the past because it always has. This became known as the problem of induction. Think about every scientific law you know. Water boils at a certain temperature. Objects fall toward the earth. The sun rises every morning. How do we know these patterns will continue tomorrow? Usually, we answer, because they've always happened before. But notice the hidden assumption. You're using the past to justify expectations about the future. Why is that reasonable? Because the future has always resembled the past. But that answer already assumes exactly what it's trying to prove. The argument becomes circular. Hume then turned his skepticism inward. What exactly is the self? Most people imagine a stable identity existing beneath all changing experiences. A permanent I. Hume searched for it. Whenever he looked inside his own mind, he found only individual experiences, thoughts, memories, emotions, sensations, desires, one after another, but never the mysterious self standing behind them. According to Hume, the self resembles this. It is not one permanent substance. It is a constantly changing collection of experiences. He called this the bundle theory of personal identity. Hume also examined religious belief with extraordinary caution. His essay, Of Miracles, remains one of the most influential discussions ever written on the subject. He asked a simple question. Suppose someone tells you they witnessed a miracle. How should a reasonable person evaluate that claim? Hume argued we must compare two possibilities. Either the miracle really occurred, or the witness is mistaken, deceived, exaggerating, or lying. Which explanation is more probable? Because miracles, by definition, contradict our ordinary experience of nature, Hume believed the evidence supporting them must be extraordinarily strong. Otherwise, the more reasonable explanation remains human error. Perhaps Hume's most surprising claim concerns reason itself. Many philosophers before him treated reason as humanity's supreme guide. Hume disagreed. He famously wrote, "Reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions." Surely reason should control emotion. But consider an ordinary example. Suppose you carefully calculate the fastest route to a restaurant. Reason helps you choose the quickest road. But why are you traveling there at all? Because you're hungry. Reason calculates. Desire motivates. Without some goal, emotion, or preference, reason has nothing to calculate toward. Logic alone cannot tell you what to value. It can only help you achieve what you already value. If reason alone cannot create values, where does morality come from? Hume's answer was remarkably humane. Human sympathy, compassion, shared emotional life. One reader found Hume almost impossible to ignore. A professor living in Königsberg, Prussia. For years, this professor had accepted many assumptions inherited from rationalist philosophy. Then he encountered Hume. Instead of asking how the mind adapts to the world, he asked whether the world we experience might already be shaped by the structure of the mind itself. His answer would permanently transform philosophy. His name was Immanuel Kant. Kant was born in 1724 in Königsberg, a city in East Prussia. Unlike philosophers such as Socrates, who wandered the streets of Athens, or Descartes, who traveled across Europe, Kant rarely left his hometown. His life became legendary for its routine. He woke at nearly the same time every day, taught at the university, wrote for several hours, then took his afternoon walk. According to a famous story, the citizens of Königsberg could practically set their clocks by seeing Kant pass through the streets. For many years, Kant admired the great rationalist philosophers, Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz. They believed reason could reveal profound truths about reality. Then Kant encountered David Hume. Hume's skepticism struck him with enormous force. If Hume was right, then causation could never be proven. Scientific laws rested upon habit rather than certainty. Metaphysics seemed impossible. Kant later admitted that Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. Instead of rejecting Hume, Kant accepted the challenge. How can science be reliable, if experience alone cannot guarantee certainty? His answer would become the foundation of modern philosophy. We never experience reality completely as it is. Every experience already passes through the structures of our own minds. Instead of the mind adapting itself entirely to objects, as we experience them, already conform to the organizing activity of the mind. This became known as Kant's Copernican revolution. Not because reality revolves around us, but because human experience cannot be understood without recognizing the mind's active role. According to Kant, space and time are not simply features waiting outside us in the external world. Rather, they are forms through which the human mind organizes experience. Imagine pouring water into different shaped containers. The water takes the shape of its container. Similarly, every experience we have is automatically arranged within space and time because those are the fundamental structures through which our minds perceive reality. We cannot step outside them. We cannot observe reality without them. They are conditions that make experience itself possible. Now we arrive at one of Kant's most famous distinctions. He argued that we must distinguish between two different kinds of reality. First, phenomena. These are things as they appear to us. The world we experience. The world science investigates. The world structured by space, time, and the categories of human understanding. Second, noumena. Things as they exist independently of our experience. Their thing in itself. Can we know the noumenal world directly? Kant answered no. Not because it doesn't exist, but because every act of knowing already involves the structures of the human mind. Imagine trying to remove your own eyes in order to see your vision itself. The very instrument required for observation prevents that kind of observation. Likewise, we cannot step outside our own minds to compare appearance with ultimate reality. Kant noticed that some truths seem universally necessary, yet also teach us something genuinely new. Take mathematics. 7 plus 5 equals 12. You don't need to perform experiments on thousands of objects to know this. Yet the answer isn't contained merely by analyzing the words themselves. Similarly, many basic principles of science appear necessary for experience to function at all. Kant called this kind of knowledge synthetic a priori. Unlike ordinary rules, which apply only under certain conditions, the categorical imperative applies universally. Its best-known formulation is remarkably simple. Act only according to that principle which you could will to become a universal law. Perhaps Kant's most beautiful moral principle follows naturally from this. Treat humanity, whether in yourself or another person, always as an end, never merely as a means. Kant believed every human being possesses intrinsic dignity. People are never merely instruments. Each person deserves respect because each possesses rational autonomy. Kant also wrote one of history's most famous essays on the Enlightenment. He defined enlightenment as humanity's emergence from self-imposed immaturity. His motto became, sapere ord. Dare to know. Or more literally, have the courage to use your own understanding. Independent thinking often requires bravery. Questioning accepted ideas has never been easy. Yet civilization advances because some people dare to think for themselves. Although Kant celebrated reason, he also emphasized its boundaries. Reason can explain the natural world, science, mathematics, ethics. But some questions remain beyond theoretical knowledge. Does God exist? Does the soul survive death? Is the universe ultimately finite or infinite? Kant believed reason inevitably reaches limits when attempting to answer such questions scientifically. This did not mean religion became meaningless. Rather, faith occupies a different domain from empirical knowledge. Reason and faith each possess their proper place. The next philosopher would transform Kant's individual mind into something vastly larger. He would argue that reality itself unfolds through reason. That history has a direction. That every conflict contains the seeds of its own resolution. His name was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was born in Stuttgart, Germany, in 1770. He entered the world just as Europe stood on the brink of enormous transformation. The Enlightenment had challenged religious authority. Then, in 1789, something happened that electrified Europe. The French Revolution. Young Hegel watched with fascination. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens openly challenged centuries of monarchy and aristocratic privilege in the name of liberty and equality. Like many young intellectuals, Hegel initially celebrated the revolution. Yet as the revolution descended into violence and the reign of terror, a troubling question emerged. Why do movements born in the name of freedom sometimes produce oppression? That question would remain at the heart of Hegel's philosophy. Earlier philosophers often described reality as something fixed. Hegel thought they had all overlooked something fundamental. Reality is not static. Reality develops. Imagine watching an oak tree. If you examine only a single moment, you see either an acorn, or a sapling, or a mature tree. But none of these stages fully captures what the tree really is. The tree exists as a process. It becomes what it is through development. Hegel believed reality itself works the same way. Nothing is fully understood in isolation. Everything becomes intelligible only through its history. Now we reach the concept most people associate with Hegel: the dialectic. You may have heard it simplified as thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Interestingly, Hegel himself almost never used those exact terms in the way they are popularly presented. But the basic idea captures something important. Development often occurs through contradiction. Imagine a society built upon one set of beliefs. Eventually, problems emerge. Tensions appear. New ideas challenge the old system. Conflict follows. Out of that conflict, a new system gradually emerges. Not simply by destroying the old one, but by preserving what was valuable while overcoming its limitations. Philosophy itself had been moving dialectically all along. Every great thinker inherited problems, transformed them, and passed new questions to the next generation. Hegel believed history itself unfolds through this dynamic process. One word appears repeatedly throughout Hegel's writings: spirit, or in German, Geist. Unfortunately, this word has caused endless confusion. Spirit does not simply mean a ghost. Nor does it refer only to religious ideas. Instead, Geist refers to the unfolding life of human consciousness. Language, culture, art, religion, science, politics, law. Everything humanity creates together. That living cultural reality is what Hegel calls spirit. History becomes the story of spirit gradually understanding itself. For Hegel, history is fundamentally the story of freedom expanding. Ancient civilizations recognized freedom for only a few: kings, nobles, citizens of certain classes. Most people remained excluded. Over centuries, however, humanity gradually recognized that freedom belongs to everyone. History advances through wars, revolutions, failures, contradictions, painful setbacks. Yet despite these tragedies, he believed an underlying movement exists. Human beings slowly become more conscious of freedom. Hegel once wrote one of philosophy's most beautiful metaphors: the owl of Minerva spreads its wings only with the falling of the dusk. What did he mean? Imagine trying to understand a historical event while it is still happening. Impossible. Too much remains uncertain. Only afterward can we see the larger pattern. Philosophy, Hegel argued, always arrives late. It does not predict history. It understands history only after events have unfolded. Wisdom often comes at sunset, not sunrise. Hegel believed humanity understands reality through three great stages. First comes art. Art reveals truth through beauty. A painting, a symphony, a sculpture. These express ideas beyond ordinary language. Next comes religion. Religion presents truth through stories, symbols, rituals, images that make profound ideas accessible to communities. Finally comes philosophy. Here, truth becomes fully conscious of itself through concepts. Notice that Hegel did not see these as enemies. Each reveals reality differently. Each contributes to humanity's understanding. Philosophy simply provides the most explicit form. The highest point of Hegel's system is what he called the absolute. This does not refer to a distant God existing outside history. Instead, the absolute is reality fully understanding itself. Individual moments of history often appear meaningless when viewed alone. The absolute represents their complete picture. Reality comprehended as one rational whole. Many readers found this idea inspiring. Others found it impossibly ambitious. After Hegel's death, his students split into opposing camps. Some emphasized religion and tradition. Others embraced radical political reform. Another philosopher launched a very different attack. He dismissed Hegel's optimism entirely. History, he argued, was not the triumph of reason. It was the endless struggle of a blind, irrational force he called the will. If Hegel believed reality was fundamentally rational, this philosopher believed reality was fundamentally tragic. His name was Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was born in 1788 in Danzig, now Gdansk, Poland. His father was a wealthy merchant who hoped his son would continue the family business. Arthur had little interest in commerce. He loved literature, art, philosophy. His childhood was marked by instability. When he was 17, his father died under circumstances many historians believe may have been suicide. His relationship with his mother, the successful novelist Johanna Schopenhauer, became equally difficult. They argued constantly. Eventually, they stopped speaking altogether. Schopenhauer increasingly withdrew into solitude. Books became his closest companions. When Schopenhauer began teaching at the University of Berlin, another philosopher dominated German intellectual life, Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Students filled Hegel's lecture hall. Schopenhauer despised him. He believed Hegel's philosophy was needlessly obscure, overly optimistic, and dangerously flattering to political authority. In an act that was either incredibly bold or incredibly foolish, Schopenhauer scheduled his own lectures at exactly the same time as Hegel's. He hoped students would choose him instead. Almost none did. Hegel's classroom remained packed. Schopenhauer often found himself lecturing to nearly empty rooms. The humiliation stayed with him for years. Schopenhauer admired Kant deeply. He accepted Kant's distinction between appearances and things in themselves. But then he asked a crucial question. If we cannot know the thing in itself through ordinary perception, is there another way to approach it? His answer began with a familiar observation. Everything we experience appears as a representation. The tree you see, the music you hear, the people around you, all arrive through the structures of consciousness. In this sense, the world is our representation. Not because reality is imaginary, but because every experience already passes through the human mind. So far, Schopenhauer largely agrees with Kant. But then he takes a dramatic step beyond him. He believed we encounter it every moment, within ourselves. Imagine lifting your arm. You don't merely observe the movement from outside. You also experience the inner impulse that produces it. This direct experience, Schopenhauer argued, reveals the deepest reality. Not reason, not consciousness, but will. Every living thing expresses this endless drive to continue existing. According to Schopenhauer, life oscillates endlessly between two states, wanting and boredom. When we lack what we desire, we suffer. When we finally obtain it, the desire disappears, leaving emptiness behind. Eventually, boredom creates new desires. The cycle begins again. Schopenhauer believed suffering was not a temporary problem. It was woven into the structure of existence itself. Perhaps no part of Schopenhauer's philosophy shocked his readers more than his analysis of romantic love. Most people believe they fall in love because they freely choose another person. Schopenhauer wasn't convinced. He argued that what we call romantic love often serves a much larger biological purpose. Nature wants reproduction. Individuals believe they pursue happiness. The species pursues survival. Schopenhauer's ethics also departed sharply from many earlier philosophers. If all living beings express the same underlying will, then another person's suffering is not entirely separate from your own. This insight gives rise to compassion. Schopenhauer believed genuine morality begins when we emotionally recognize the suffering of others. Compassion weakens selfishness. Schopenhauer was also one of the earliest European philosophers to study Indian philosophy seriously. He read translations of the Upanishads with enormous admiration. He also found striking similarities between his own philosophy and Buddhism. Both emphasized desire as a source of suffering. Both valued detachment. Both sought liberation from endless craving. Of course, Schopenhauer's philosophy remained distinct from these traditions. For most of his life, Schopenhauer believed the philosophical world had ignored him. Then, quite unexpectedly, everything changed. As Hegel's influence began to fade, readers discovered Schopenhauer. Among them was a young reader who admired Schopenhauer's diagnosis. But he rejected his cure. Instead of escaping suffering, he wanted to embrace it. Instead of denying life, He wanted to celebrate it. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche.
Guten Abend, gut Nacht, mit Rosen.
Nietzsche was born in 1844 in the small German village of Rocken. His father was a Lutheran pastor. Religion surrounded his childhood. But tragedy arrived early. When Nietzsche was only 4 years old, his father died after a long illness. Soon afterward, his younger brother also passed away. The family became a household almost entirely of women. His mother, his grandmother, his sisters, several aunts. The quiet, thoughtful boy who grew up there showed extraordinary academic talent, especially in languages. By his early 20s, he had mastered Greek and Latin so thoroughly that, at just 24 years old, he became a professor of classical philology at the University of Basel. He was one of the youngest professors in Europe. During his early years, Nietzsche found two intellectual heroes, the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer and the composer Richard Wagner. Schopenhauer offered a fearless confrontation with suffering. Wagner seemed capable of reviving the spiritual power of ancient Greek tragedy through music. Nietzsche admired both intensely. His first major book, The Birth of Tragedy, argued that ancient Greek culture achieved greatness by balancing two opposing forces. He named them after two Greek gods. Apollo represented order, reason, harmony, beauty. Dionysus represented passion, chaos, ecstasy, creation. Great civilizations, Nietzsche believed, emerge when these two forces remain in creative tension, not when one completely destroys the other. Despite his extraordinary intellect, Nietzsche's health steadily deteriorated. He suffered from crippling migraines, digestive disorders, failing eyesight, persistent exhaustion. Eventually, he resigned from his university position while still relatively young. For the rest of his productive life, he wandered across Switzerland, Italy, and southern France, writing alone, living modestly, publishing books that sold almost no copies. Now we arrive at Nietzsche's most famous declaration. What did he actually mean when he said, "God is dead"? He was not claiming that a supernatural being had literally died. Instead, he was describing a historical transformation. For centuries, European civilization had grounded its morality, purpose, and meaning in Christianity. But science, historical criticism, the Enlightenment, and modern philosophy had gradually weakened that foundation. Many people no longer truly believed. Yet they continued living as though the old moral framework remained intact. Nietzsche believed this was impossible. If belief in God disappears, the entire system of values built upon it must also be questioned. The death of God creates a dangerous possibility: nihilism. The belief that life possesses no objective meaning, no ultimate purpose. Nietzsche feared European civilization was entering exactly this situation. Traditional values were collapsing. New values had not yet emerged. The result could be despair, cynicism, or complete meaninglessness. If old values no longer guide humanity, who creates new ones? Nietzsche answered with one of philosophy's most controversial ideas, the Übermensch, often translated as Overman or Superman. The Übermensch represents an ideal of self-overcoming, someone who refuses merely to inherit values from tradition. Instead, they create meaning through their own lives. Nietzsche believed modern humanity must become creators of values rather than passive followers of inherited beliefs. The Übermensch symbolizes this creative courage. Earlier, Schopenhauer argued that reality is driven by the will, a blind force producing endless suffering. Nietzsche accepted the importance of the will, but transformed its meaning completely. The deepest drive in living beings, he argued, is not merely survival, nor pleasure, nor happiness. It is their will to power. Power here does not simply mean political control. It means growth, expansion, creation, self-mastery. Life flourishes by overcoming resistance. Without struggle, there is no greatness. This became one of Nietzsche's central themes. Nietzsche then turned his attention to morality itself. Where do moral values come from? He argued that history produced two very different moral outlooks. The first he called master morality. Here, virtues include strength, courage, confidence, excellence, pride. The second he called slave morality. According to Nietzsche, oppressed groups gradually redefined weakness as virtue. Humility, obedience, self-denial, patience, compassion. He did not simply argue that kindness is bad. nor did he encourage cruelty. Instead, he believed many moral systems emerged from historical struggles for power rather than eternal truths. Perhaps Nietzsche's most profound thought experiment is the eternal recurrence. Imagine a mysterious figure appears before you tonight. He tells you, everything you have ever lived, every joy, every failure, every heartbreak, every embarrassment, every triumph, will repeat exactly the same way, forever. Nothing changes. Nothing improves. Nothing disappears. Your entire life returns again, and again, and again. How would you respond? Would this thought crush you, or would you embrace it? Nietzsche believed this question reveals how deeply we affirm our own existence. Can you love your life so completely, that you would willingly live it forever? Closely connected to eternal recurrence is another famous phrase. Amor fati. Love your fate. Notice the difference between accepting fate and loving it. Acceptance merely tolerates necessity. Love transforms necessity into affirmation. In January 1889, while living in Turin, Italy, Nietzsche witnessed a horse being violently whipped by its driver. According to the famous story, Nietzsche rushed forward, threw his arms around the horse's neck, then collapsed. Whether every detail is historically accurate remains uncertain. What is certain is that shortly afterward, Nietzsche suffered a devastating mental breakdown. He never fully recovered. For the remaining 11 years of his life, his mother, and later his sister, cared for him. Unfortunately, after his collapse, his sister Elizabeth Foster Nietzsche edited and selectively presented parts of his writings to align them with German nationalism and ideas that Nietzsche himself had repeatedly criticized. Decades later, the Nazis would misuse fragments of his work to support their ideology. Nietzsche demolished old certainties. Yet after removing so many foundations, one question remained. How do ordinary human beings actually experience existence? The next philosophers would move away from grand systems. Instead, they would examine lived experience itself. One of them would become known as the father of phenomenology. The other would transform existential philosophy forever. The first was Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl was born in 1859 in what is now the Czech Republic. Unlike many philosophers before him, Husserl did not begin with theology or classical literature. He began with mathematics. He even studied under some of Europe's greatest mathematicians. At first, he believed philosophy should become just as rigorous as mathematics. But gradually he encountered a troubling question. Mathematics depends upon human thinking. Science depends upon human observation. Logic depends upon human understanding. Before explaining the world, shouldn't philosophy first explain consciousness itself? That question changed the direction of his life. By Husserl's time, philosophy faced a difficult situation. Science had become astonishingly successful. Many people began believing philosophy had become unnecessary. Husserl disagreed. Science explains objects. But science itself depends upon observers. Who studies the observer? Who explains consciousness? Without understanding experience itself, Husserl adopted a famous motto. Back to the things themselves. At first, this sounds like a call to study physical objects. It isn't. Instead, Husserl wanted philosophers to return to experience before theoretical explanations distort it. This became the foundation of phenomenology. The careful description of conscious experience exactly as it appears. Phenomenology does not begin by asking whether the external world exists. Instead, it asks, how is the world experienced? Consciousness actively organizes experience into meaningful wholes. One of Husserl's most important ideas concerns intentionality. Despite the name, it has nothing to do with intentions in the everyday sense. Instead, intentionality means that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Whenever you think about something. Whenever you remember something. Whenever you fear something. Consciousness is never empty. It is always directed toward an object. Instead of treating mind as a sealed container, Husserl showed that consciousness is fundamentally relational. Mind and world belong together. Now we reach one of Husserl's most unusual methods. He called it epoche, often translated as bracketing. Suppose someone asks, does this tree really exist? Most philosophers immediately begin arguing. Realism. Idealism. Materialism. Husserl suggests something different. Temporarily set that question aside. Not because it lacks importance, but because it distracts from a more immediate task. Instead, examine how the tree appears within experience. Its color, its texture, its distance, its meaning, its relation to memory, its place within perception. By placing ordinary assumptions inside brackets, Husserl believed we discover structures of consciousness usually hidden by habit. Husserl also transformed our understanding of time. Imagine listening to someone play the piano. If consciousness experienced only isolated instants, music would be impossible. Each note would vanish before the next arrived. Yet melodies exist. Why? Because consciousness retains the immediate past while anticipating the immediate future. The present is never an isolated point. It is a flowing structure. Memory, attention, expectation, all work together continuously. Husserl's later years unfolded during one of Europe's darkest periods. Because he was born into a Jewish family, the rise of Nazi Germany had devastating consequences. Although Husserl had converted to Christianity decades earlier, Nazi racial laws still classified him as Jewish. He gradually found himself isolated from academic life. Husserl died in 1938, just before Europe descended into the catastrophe of the Second World War. Husserl described consciousness brilliantly. Yet another philosopher wondered whether consciousness was still receiving too much attention. Perhaps the deeper mystery was not consciousness, but existence itself. What does it mean for anything to exist? The next philosopher believed Western civilization had forgotten this question for over 2,000 years. He would attempt to recover it. His name was Martin Heidegger. Martin Heidegger was born in 1889 in the small German town of Meßkirch. Unlike many philosophers raised in wealthy intellectual circles, Heidegger grew up in a modest Catholic family. His father worked as a church sexton. As a young man, Heidegger seriously considered becoming a priest. He studied theology before gradually turning toward philosophy. When he encountered Edmund Husserl's phenomenology, he immediately recognized its revolutionary potential. But he also believed phenomenology had stopped too soon. Husserl focused on consciousness. Heidegger wanted to investigate something even more basic: the human being who is conscious. In 1927, Heidegger published one of the most influential, and notoriously difficult, books in philosophy, Being and Time. Many readers opened the first few pages, became hopelessly confused, and quietly closed the book again. Yet beneath its unfamiliar vocabulary lies a surprisingly human question. What does it actually mean to exist? Not theoretically, not scientifically, but personally. How do we find ourselves already living in a world before we ever begin reflecting on it? This became the central problem of Heidegger's philosophy. To answer that question, Heidegger introduced one of philosophy's most famous terms: Dasein. The German word literally means being there. Imagine waking up in the middle of a play. The actors are already speaking. The story has already begun. You never chose the stage. You never selected the script. Yet somehow, you must participate. That is Dasein. Human beings always find themselves already existing in a world they did not create. Heidegger called this condition thrownness. None of us chose the century into which we were born. Our language, our parents, our culture, our genetics, our childhood, these are simply given. We are thrown into existence before we ever begin making choices. Freedom, Heidegger argued, always begins within circumstances we did not choose. Earlier philosophers often imagined the mind as something separate from the external world. Heidegger rejected this completely. We are never detached observers floating outside reality. Instead, we are always being in the world. Our relationship with the world begins through involvement, not detached observation. Now Heidegger turns toward ordinary social life. Imagine asking someone why they dress a certain way. They answer, everyone does. Why believe certain opinions? Because that's what everyone says. No individual person is actually making the decision. Instead, an anonymous social force seems to speak through them. Heidegger called this the they. Or in German, das Man, the they represents conformity. The invisible pressure to think, behave, and live according to what everyone else considers normal. Can we escape the they? Heidegger believed we can. But not easily. He called this possibility authenticity. Authenticity does not mean expressing every emotion. Instead, it means taking responsibility for your own existence. Authenticity means recognizing that no one else can ultimately make that choice for you. You alone must live your life. No one can exist in your place. Now we reach perhaps Heidegger's most famous idea. Imagine someone tells you exactly when your life will end. Every decision suddenly changes. Time becomes precious. Heidegger argued that death is not simply an event waiting at the end of life. It shapes every moment of existence. Human beings are being toward death. Unlike other creatures, we know our lives are finite. This awareness gives urgency to every choice. Later in life, Heidegger became deeply concerned about modern technology. Technology changes how we see reality. Heidegger worried that modern technological thinking encourages us to view everything, including nature and even human beings, as resources waiting to be used. When efficiency becomes our only value, something essential about existence disappears. In 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. That same year, Heidegger joined the Nazi Party. He accepted the position of rector at the University of Freiburg. During this period, he delivered speeches expressing support for the new regime. Although he later resigned as rector and his relationship with Nazi authorities became increasingly complicated, he never offered the kind of clear, public reckoning many believed was necessary after the war. Heidegger described existence with extraordinary depth. Yet many readers found his writing almost impossibly difficult. One younger philosopher admired Heidegger enormously. But he wanted these ideas to leave university lecture halls. He wanted philosophy to enter cafes, theaters, novels, politics, everyday life. If Heidegger asked, "What does it mean to be?" this philosopher asked, "What does it mean to choose?" His philosophy would become known simply as existentialism. His name was Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre was born in Paris in 1905. His father died when he was still an infant, leaving him to be raised primarily by his mother and grandparents. He was a brilliant student. When the Second World War erupted, Sartre served in the French army. In 1940, he was captured by German forces. For nearly a year, he lived as a prisoner of war. Even in captivity, he continued reading philosophy. After his release, Sartre returned to occupied Paris. There, his philosophy began taking shape against the backdrop of war, dictatorship, and human suffering. Now we reach Sartre's most famous idea. Existence precedes essence. At first, the phrase sounds confusing. Let's simplify it. Imagine a craftsman making a paper cutter. Before building it, he already knows exactly what it is for. Its purpose exists before the object itself. Human beings, Sartre argued, are different. No divine craftsman designed us with a fixed purpose. We simply appear. We exist first. Only afterward, through our choices, do we gradually create who we become. This leads to Sartre's most radical conclusion. Human beings are fundamentally free. This doesn't mean external circumstances don't matter. Poverty, war, illness, oppression, all place real limits upon our lives. But within those limits, Sartre argued, we still remain responsible for our responses. Freedom is not unlimited possibility. It is the unavoidable necessity of choosing. One of Sartre's most famous sentences captures this idea perfectly. Man is condemned to be free. Why condemned? Because we never asked to exist. Like Heidegger's thrownness, we simply find ourselves here. But once we exist, every action becomes our responsibility. If freedom is so demanding, how do people avoid it? Sartre answered with another famous concept. Bad faith. Imagine a waiter who performs every movement with exaggerated precision. Every smile feels rehearsed. Every gesture resembles an actor following a script. Sartre asks, has this person begun believing they are nothing more than a waiter? Or consider someone who says, I'm just this kind of person. I can't change. I have no choice. According to Sartre, these statements often hide from freedom. Bad faith occurs when we pretend we are fixed objects rather than free beings. It is a kind of self-deception. Not lying to others. Lying to ourselves. Imagine sitting alone in a room. You feel completely relaxed. Then suddenly, you realize someone has been watching you through the doorway. Instantly, everything changes. You become aware of yourself through another person's eyes. Sartre called this experience the look. Other people do more than observe us. They shape how we experience ourselves. This creates tension. We want to remain free, yet we also become objects within other people's perceptions. One of Sartre's most quoted lines comes from his play No Exit. Hell is other people. He meant that living entirely through the judgment of others can imprison us. In his famous lecture Existentialism is a Humanism, he argued the opposite. Existentialism is hopeful precisely because it refuses excuses. You are not trapped by destiny. Not imprisoned by human nature. Not completely determined by your past. Tomorrow remains open. The future has not yet been written. Who you become depends largely upon what you choose next. Unlike many earlier philosophers who remained primarily academic thinkers, Sartre became deeply involved in public life. He wrote novels, plays, political essays, journalism. He supported anti-colonial movements, criticized authoritarian governments. Sartre believed individuals create themselves through freedom. A younger generation of French philosophers wasn't entirely convinced. They asked a difficult question. Are we really as free as we imagine? What if invisible systems shape us long before we begin choosing? Perhaps power operates far more subtly than political force alone. Perhaps society quietly produces the kinds of people we become. The next philosopher would spend his career uncovering these invisible networks of power. He would argue that knowledge and power can never truly be separated. His name was Michel Foucault. Michel Foucault was born in France in 1926. His family expected him to become a doctor. Instead, he became fascinated by psychology, philosophy, and history. As a student, he struggled with periods of severe depression and isolation. These personal experiences made him deeply interested in people whom society considered abnormal. Many philosophers before Foucault believed history gradually progresses toward greater reason or freedom. Foucault was deeply skeptical. History, he argued, does not move along one grand path. Instead, it is filled with unexpected breaks, sudden transformations, changing systems of thought. To uncover these hidden changes, Foucault developed what he called the archaeology of knowledge. Imagine an archaeologist carefully digging beneath layers of earth. Each layer reveals a different civilization. Foucault believed ideas work the same way. Beneath modern thinking lie older systems that once determined what people considered true. One of Foucault's earliest books explored the history of mental illness. He asked, who decides what counts as sanity? Throughout history, societies have treated mental illness in dramatically different ways. Sometimes the mentally ill were seen as spiritually gifted. Sometimes as dangerous. Sometimes as criminals. Sometimes as patients. These changing definitions reveal something important. Categories we often consider natural may actually be historical creations. This does not mean mental illness is imaginary. Rather, it means our understanding of it changes alongside culture. Now we arrive at Foucault's most famous idea. Power and knowledge are inseparable. Traditionally, philosophers imagined knowledge as something objective, independent, neutral. Foucault disagreed. Imagine a government conducting a census, schools measuring student performance, companies collecting personal data. All produce knowledge. But they also increase the ability to organize, classify, predict, and influence people. Knowledge creates power. Power creates new forms of knowledge. The two constantly reinforce one another. To explain modern power, Foucault borrowed an idea from the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the panopticon. Imagine a circular prison. Cells line the outer wall. A watchtower stands at the center. Prisoners cannot tell whether anyone is actually watching them. So they behave as though someone always is. Eventually, constant surveillance becomes unnecessary. The prisoners begin monitoring themselves. Foucault believed modern society increasingly works this way. We internalize observation. We discipline ourselves before anyone else needs to. Another of Foucault's revolutionary arguments concerned sexuality. Many people assume modern society became increasingly open about sex. Foucault noticed something different. Far from remaining silent, modern societies constantly discuss sexuality. The result is not simply greater freedom. It is also greater classification. The more we speak about sexuality, the more categories emerge. Normal, abnormal, healthy, unhealthy, acceptable, Unacceptable. Foucault encouraged readers to examine who creates these categories, and why. As societies developed, governments became interested not only in ruling territories, but also in managing populations. Birth rates, public health, life expectancy, vaccination, nutrition, employment, education. Foucault called this new form of authority biopower. Instead of exercising power mainly through threats, modern governments increasingly shape life itself. By now, our journey through Western philosophy has become extraordinary. After all these revolutions, one final question remains. Can philosophy still speak clearly? Must profound ideas always require complicated language? The final philosopher in our journey believed the answer was no. He became one of the founders of analytic philosophy, and one of the greatest public intellectuals of the 20th century. His name was Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell was born in Wales in 1872 into one of Britain's most distinguished aristocratic families. But privilege did not protect him from tragedy. His mother died when he was only 2 years old. His father died soon afterward. By the age of 4, Russell had become an orphan. He was raised by his strict Victorian grandparents. The household valued discipline, duty, religion, but Russell often felt isolated. Years later, he admitted that books and mathematics probably saved his life. For him, logic wasn't merely an academic subject. It became a source of stability in an uncertain world. Throughout history, philosophers had relied upon logic. Russell wanted to bring that dream to life. He believed mathematics itself could be built entirely upon logical principles. If successful, the entire foundation of mathematics would become perfectly secure. It was one of the most ambitious intellectual projects ever attempted. Then something extraordinary happened. While studying the foundations of mathematics, Russell discovered a contradiction that shook the entire field. Imagine a barber who shaves every man in town, who does not shave himself. Simple enough. Now ask the obvious question. Who shaves the barber? If he shaves himself, then according to the rule, he shouldn't. But if he doesn't shave himself, then according to the rule, he should. The contradiction seems unavoidable. Russell uncovered a similar problem inside mathematical set theory. It became known as Russell's paradox. Russell joined forces with another brilliant philosopher and mathematician, Alfred North Whitehead. Together, they spent nearly a decade writing one of the longest and most demanding works in mathematical history, Principia Mathematica. Its goal was astonishing: to derive all of mathematics from a small number of logical principles. One famous story perfectly captures its complexity. Hundreds of pages pass before the authors finally prove that 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Because Russell wanted absolute logical certainty. Russell also became one of the founders of analytic philosophy. Instead of constructing enormous systems explaining the entire universe, analytic philosophers focused on careful reasoning, clear definitions, precise arguments. Language itself became an object of philosophical investigation. Russell believed many ancient philosophical puzzles survived because language easily confuses us. Russell often defended philosophy against critics who dismissed it as impractical. He offered a beautiful answer. The value of philosophy does not lie primarily in providing definite answers. Instead, philosophy expands our imagination. It weakens dogmatism. It teaches intellectual humility. Like Nietzsche before him, Russell became one of the 20th century's most famous critics of religion. In his celebrated lecture, Why I Am Not a Christian, he argued that beliefs should be supported by evidence rather than tradition or authority. Russell did not encourage hatred toward religious people. His deeper concern was intellectual honesty. Believe something because it is true, not because it is comforting. Unlike many philosophers who remained primarily writers, Russell became deeply involved in public affairs. He opposed the First World War. His anti-war activism even led to imprisonment. Later, during the Cold War, he campaigned passionately against nuclear weapons. Together with Albert Einstein, Russell issued the famous Russell-Einstein Manifesto, urging humanity to recognize the catastrophic dangers of nuclear conflict. One sentence from that manifesto still echoes today: remember your humanity, and forget the rest. For Russell, philosophy carried ethical responsibility. Clear thinking should improve human life, not merely win arguments. Russell also believed education should cultivate curiosity rather than obedience. Children should not merely memorize facts. They should learn to question, to investigate, to doubt respectfully, to think independently. Notice how this ideal reaches all the way back to Socrates. Across more than 2,000 years, the conversation comes full circle.